Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime Historian. Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back to a time when life was full of shifting loyalties and grand ambitions in the heart of the ancient world. Imagine the narrow streets of Rome crowded with merchants calling out prices for olives and fresh bread, while senators in their togas debated the fate of the Republic in grand halls nearby. This was an era when a single speech or battlefield decision could change everything, and one man named Marcus Antonius, later known to many as Mark Antony, found himself right at the centre of it all. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're listening from somewhere tonight, drop a quick comment with your city and the local time. I always enjoy seeing where the stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Marcus Antonius was born that year to a family of plebeian nobility. The Antonii could trace their line back to earlier consuls, but by the late Republic the name carried more tradition than current influence or riches. His father, Marcus Antonius Creticus, reached the praetorship and governed Cilicia for a time before dying in 71 BC. His mother Julia belonged to the Julii Caesars, giving Antony a family tie, however distant, to the young Gaius Julius Caesar. The Rome into which he arrived was still settling after the civil wars of Marius and Sulla. The fighting had ended only a few years before, and though the city looked much the same, people carried the memory in their daily conversations. In neighbourhoods like the Subura, mornings brought the smell of bread baking in large public ovens, the low rumble of carts from Ostia delivering grain, and the calls of vendors selling oil, wine, figs, and sausages from small shops along narrow lanes. Children played in shared courtyards between tall apartment blocks where laundry hung on lines, and the constant sound of footsteps and voices filled the air. The family home stood on one of the quieter hills, perhaps the Caelian or Esquiline, with a central atrium open to the sky. Rainwater collected in the shallow basin beneath the opening, and in cooler months slaves kept braziers lit to warm the rooms. Meals centred on simple foods: thick porridge of emmer wheat, stewed vegetables seasoned with herbs, cheese, and dried fruit. Meat came more often after religious festivals or sacrifices, when portions were distributed. From early years, Antony learned Latin and Greek under a tutor, practicing letters on wax tablets and listening to household talk about Senate matters, grain distributions, and provincial appointments. His father's early death left the household in tighter circumstances. Julia later married Lentulus Sura, but that brought political difficulties more than financial stability. As he grew into his teens, Antony showed a preference for social life over quiet study. He stood tall and broad, kept a fuller beard than the current style, and let his hair fall in loose curls. He spent evenings in taverns near the Circus Maximus with young men like Gaius Scribonius Curio, where soldiers on leave and locals drank sour wine mixed with water, rolled dice on crates, and shared accounts of campaigns or city events. Curio, quick and engaging, became a lasting friend even as their paths later diverged in politics. Debts built up over time. Moneylenders with high rates followed him through the alleys near the Forum. The sums covered losses at games, dinners with companions, and the need to maintain a suitable appearance. When the pressure grew too heavy and legal action threatened, he left Rome around 58 BC for Athens. The city still showed traces of Sulla's earlier siege, but the agora remained lively, with students from many regions. Antony attended some philosophy lectures and practiced rhetoric, declaiming from Demosthenes and Homer, though he spent considerable time in gymnasia and gatherings. The change gave him distance from Rome's immediate demands. He stayed only a short while before returning and then choosing military service. In 57 BC, he joined Aulus Gabinius in Syria as a cavalry officer. The journey east past Sicily, Crete, and the Peloponnese over weeks at sea until they reached the Syrian shore. In Judea, he saw real combat for the first time. Gabinius restored Ptolemy XII to Egypt's throne, and Antony led a cavalry charge at Pelusium that broke through the defenders and helped take the gates. The action involved dust, shouts in several languages, rearing horses and splintering spears. His part earned notice for courage and decisiveness. Later in Egypt he entered Alexandria. The broad canopic way stretched lined with columns and statues, temples released incense into the air, and harbours bustled with grain ships. The sights stayed with him. Back in Rome the city had grown more tense. Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar shared the consulship in 55 BC, but street gangs under Clodius and Milo fought for control of districts, leaving occasional blood on stones near public buildings. Antony kept a low profile and prepared his next move. By 54 BC he attached himself to Caesar in Gaul through the family connection. Caesar accepted the energetic relative onto his staff as military tribune. Camps along the Rhine frontier smelled of smoke from cooking fires and damp wool. Legionaries ate barley porridge, hard cheese and bacon when available. Antony learned daily orders, weapon inspections, and drilling in tight formations. He marched through dense forests, crossed rivers on temporary bridges, and observed Caesar dealing with Gallic leaders in open meetings. These years shaped his routines. He drank wine in evenings, diluted but stayed functional for duties. He kept equipment in order, his mount cared for, and instructions direct. The soldiers appreciated his sharing of their conditions, from sleeping arrangements to rations. Caesar, ever observant, assigned him increasing responsibility. Youthful debts in Antony's return from Athens did not bring lasting calm to his affairs in Rome. The debts he had left behind had not vanished. If anything, interest had compounded them during his absence. Moneylenders, many of them freedmen or small bankers operating from booths in the Forum, sent messengers to his door or waited in the streets he frequented. Some carried wax tablets listing exact amounts owed, with dates and rates noted in precise columns. He tried various ways to manage the situation. At times he borrowed from one creditor to pay another, a common enough practice among young nobles in similar straits. Friends like Curio occasionally helped with small loans or introductions to more lenient lenders. But the circle of obligations tightened. Creditors could take legal action through the courts, seizing property or even, in extreme cases, leading to debtors' bonds that restricted personal freedom. Antony avoided open confrontation, preferring to move through the city in a way that kept him out of easy reach. Daily life in Rome continued around him with its familiar rhythms. He rose early enough to attend the salutatio if he wished visiting senior patrons in their atria to offer greetings and seek favours, but he often skipped these formalities. Instead, he walked the streets where barbers shaved clients in open-fronted shops, where fullers trod cloth in vats of urine and water to clean and thicken wool, and where bakers pulled flat loaves from clay ovens. The smell of fresh urine from the fuller's vats mixed with the aroma of baking bread and the occasional whiff of roasting meat from street-side cookshops. He maintained contacts in the political world through family ties and old friendships. His stepfather Lentulus Sura's involvement in the Catilinarian conspiracy of 63 BC had ended in execution, which brought some stigma to the household, but did not sever Antony's connections entirely. Julia, his mother, continued to manage what remained of family resources. She received visitors and handled correspondence, keeping the domus functioning. Antony's habits leaned toward enjoyment rather than restraint. He liked the company of actors, musicians, and dancers who performed at private dinners or public festivals. These gatherings often lasted late, with guests reclining on couches, eating courses of fish, poultry, and fruits served on silver platters when hosts could afford them, or simpler fare on pottery when means were limited. Wine flowed freely, sometimes unmixed for those who preferred strength. Antony developed a taste for stronger varieties and drank more than moderation required, though he retained enough control to rise the next day without complete incapacity. Gambling added to his expenses. Dice games took place in taverns or at friends' homes, with stakes ranging from small coins to sums that could strain finances for months. He won some nights and lost others, but losses accumulated over time. Curio shared this interest, and the two spent many evenings together rolling knuckle bones or wooden dice, laughing at fortunate throws and shrugging at bad ones. The political atmosphere grew more charged as the first triumvirate of Pompey, Crassus and Caesar held sway. Gangs controlled parts of the city, clashing over influence and elections. Clodius, a patrician who had himself adopted into a plebeian family to become tribune, used violence to push his agenda. Milo led opposing forces. Antony stayed on the edges of these conflicts, not yet committing to any side fully. He observed how power shifted through alliances, money, and the threat of force. Around 58 BC, with creditors pressing harder and no clear path to settle accounts through ordinary means, he decided to leave Rome again. This time he joined the staff of Aulus Gabinius, who had been assigned proconsular command in Syria. The appointment offered escape from immediate pressure and a chance at military distinction, which could bring wealth through plunder or rewards. Gabinius needed capable officers, and Antony's family name and early reputation for energy helped secure the position. He gathered what equipment he could: armour, weapons, horses, and joined the expedition. The departure from Rome meant sailing from Ostia or another port, watching the coastline recede as the ship headed east. Crews rowed when winds failed, and passengers endured the motion of the sea, the smell of tar and salt, and the shared discomfort of close quarters. The voyage took them past familiar landmarks: the Italian shore, then Sicily with its steep cliffs and fertile fields, Crete with its mountainous interior, and finally toward the eastern Mediterranean. Antony passed time on deck, talking with fellow officers about what lay ahead, or below in the dim hold where men slept on benches or the decking. Arrival in Syria brought new surroundings. The province included cities like Antioch, with wide streets, theatres and markets selling goods from farther east. Local people spoke Greek and Aramaic, wore tunics of finer linen, and followed customs different from Roman ones. Antony adapted to the climate hotter and drier than Italy, and to the routines of provincial administration. Gabinius faced immediate tasks. One involved restoring Ptolemy XII Auletes to the Egyptian throne. Ptolemy had been expelled by his subjects and now paid large sums for Roman help. The expedition moved south into Judea, and then toward Egypt. Antony served as a cavalry commander, leading horsemen recruited from Gaul or local auxiliaries. In Judea, the campaign brought fighting near Pelusium, a fortified gateway to Egypt. Antony directed a charge that helped break the defending lines. The battle produced dust clouds, the clang of weapons, cries in multiple tongues, and the confusion of men and horses in close combat. Success came through quick action and personal leadership. The gates opened, and Ptolemy regained control. The force continued into Egypt. Alexandria welcomed them with its harbours full of ships, its lighthouse visible from far off, and its streets laid out in a grid. Antony saw the palace district, the library, the Mauseon where scholars worked, and the mixture of Greek, Egyptian, and other peoples living side by side. The experience introduced him to a different scale of wealth and culture. After completing the restoration, Gabinius returned to Syria. Antony stayed in the region for a time, handling duties that included collecting funds and maintaining order. He earned some money through his share of arrangements, though much went to debts back home. The eastern posting gave him practical experience in command and logistics. By 55 or 54 BC, he returned to Rome. The city had changed little in surface appearance, but political alignment shifted as Caesar prepared for longer campaigns in Gaul. Antony, now with military credentials, looked for a new patron. The family connection through his mother made Caesar the logical choice. He travelled north to join Caesar's staff, leaving behind the pressures of Rome's creditors and streets for the open camps and marching roads of the provinces. Cavalry service. In Syria, Antony's arrival in the eastern provinces with Gabinius marked his first extended experience outside Italy. The Syrian command covered a wide area, from the Mediterranean coast to inland regions bordering Parthia and the Nabatean kingdom. Cities like Antioch served as administrative centres, with Roman officials overseeing tax collection, local justice, and military readiness. The climate differed sharply from Rome's summers, hot and dry, winters milder but wetter in some areas. Dust rose from unpaved roads when columns moved, and the air carried scents of pine from nearby hills or spices from caravans arriving from farther east. Gabinius had taken up his post in 57 BC, with orders to stabilise the region after earlier unrest. Ptolemy XII Auletes, the Egyptian king, had been driven from his throne by Alexandrian factions and now sought Roman intervention. He offered large payments to secure support, a common arrangement in provincial dealings where money often smoothed political paths. Gabinius accepted the commission, seeing both profit and opportunity for military distinction. The expedition required assembling forces. Gabinius drew on legionaries already in the province, auxiliary troops, and cavalry units. Antony, as a young officer with some Athenian training but little prior combat, received command of a cavalry contingent. These horsemen included Roman citizens serving as equites, allied contingents from Gaul or Spain, and local recruits familiar with the terrain. Horses came from regional breeds, sturdy, sure-footed animals suited to long marches and sudden charges. Daily camp life followed a structured pattern. Reveille came before dawn, with centurions calling men to formation. Breakfast consisted of wheat biscuits baked the night before, olives, cheese, and watered wine carried in skins. Officers ate similar fare unless personal supplies allowed additions like dried figs or honey. Tents were struck, baggage loaded onto mules, and the column formed up with scouts ahead and flankers on the sides. Marches covered 20 to 30 miles on good days, following Roman roads where they existed or native tracks otherwise. In Judea, the campaign turned to fighting. Aristobulus II, a Hasmonean claimant, had raised forces against Roman authority and against Ptolemy's restoration. Gabinius moved south through the region, passing Jerusalem with its high walls and temple complex visible from a distance. Near Pelusium, the gateway city to Egypt, the two sides met. Antony's cavalry played a key role in the engagement. The battle unfolded on open ground near the fortified town. Defenders had prepared trenches and stakes, but Roman discipline and mobility prevailed. Antony led his squadron in a flanking manoeuvre, charging into the enemy line where infantry stood exposed. The impact came fast, hooves pounding, lances levelled, men shouting as they closed. Dust obscured much of the view, but the momentum carried through. Several defenders fell under the weight of horse and rider. Others broke and ran toward the gates. Antony pressed the advantage, helping to open a path for the infantry to follow. The action lasted perhaps an hour before the position collapsed. Pelusium surrendered soon after. The city gates swung wide, and Roman standards advanced through streets lined with mud brick houses and palm groves. Local inhabitants watched from rooftops or doorways, uncertain about the change in rulers. Ptolemy entered under Roman protection, resuming his throne with Gabinius's backing. The king rewarded his supporters generously gold, grain, and promises of future favour. The force continued into Egypt proper. The march to Alexandria took them along the Nile Delta, where fertile fields stretched on either side and canals carried water to irrigation channels. Villages consisted of low houses built of sun-dried brick, with flat roofs used for drying dates and grain. Children tended goats and ducks near the water. Women carried jars on their heads from wells or the river. The air smelled of wet earth and lotus flowers in season. Alexandria itself presented a different world. The city had been laid out on a grid by Alexander's architects, with broad avenues crossing at right angles. The canopic way ran east-west, bordered by colonnades and statues of gods and kings. Harbours on both sides bustled with merchant ships from Greece, Phoenicia, and farther afield. Grain silos stood near the docks, ready to load vessels bound for Rome and other ports. The great lighthouse on Pharos Island sent its beacon far out to sea, guiding ships through the night. Antony walked the streets during the brief stay. Markets offered goods unavailable in Rome, fine linens dyed in purple or saffron, papyrus rolls, glassware from local workshops, and incense from Arabia. Food stalls sold flatbreads stuffed with spiced meat, lentils cooked with cumin, and sweets made from dates and nuts. People spoke Greek as the common tongue, though Egyptian dialects filled the back streets. He saw the palace quarter with its marble halls and gardens, and glimpsed the Mausoleum where scholars debated philosophy and mathematics. The restoration complete, Ptolemy settled into rule under Roman oversight. Gabinius withdrew his forces, leaving a garrison to ensure stability. Antony remained in the region for a time, involved in administrative tasks. These included escorting funds back to the treasury, supervising supply depots, and handling relations with local notables. He acquired some personal wealth through shares of the arrangements. Ptolemy's payments had been substantial, and used part of it to ease earlier debts in Rome. The eastern posting lasted into 55 BC. Antony gained practical knowledge of command, how to keep men fed and watered on long marches, how to read terrain for ambushes, and how to negotiate with local leaders who spoke different languages. He learned the value of speed in cavalry operations and the importance of discipline when facing irregular forces. By late 55 or early 54 BC, he prepared to return west. The journey back followed much the same route in reverse, with stops at ports where ships took on fresh water and provisions. He carried letters of recommendation from Gabinius, and a growing reputation for bravery in the Pelusium action. Rome awaited, but now with a different perspective. The city he had left in financial difficulty no longer seemed quite so confining. Military service had opened paths that debts alone could not close. Upon arrival, he found the political landscape shifting again. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul had brought him wealth and prestige, and the family connection through Julia made an approach natural. Antony sought a place on Caesar's staff, offering his recent experience in exchange for patronage and opportunity. Caesar, always in need of capable officers, accepted. The move north to Gaul would come soon, carrying Antony into a longer and more demanding phase of his career. Staff officer under Antony reached Caesar's headquarters in Gaul during the campaigning season of 54 BC. The journey north from Italy took him through Cisalpine Gaul, where Roman colonies dotted the Po Valley and native tribes lived in hilltop settlements. He travelled with a small retinue, carrying letters of introduction and his own equipment, armour, weapons, and a favourite horse acquired in the east. The roads, well maintained in this province, allowed steady progress, with posting stations providing fresh mounts and meals of bread, cheese, and local wine. Caesar had been in Gaul for 5 years by then, extending Roman control far beyond the old province. His headquarters shifted with the seasons, but often lay near the Rhine or in central Gaul, close to major legionary camps. Antony found Caesar surrounded by a staff of experienced officers, young nobles seeking advancement, and freedmen handling correspondence. The general greeted his distant relative cordially, noting the reports from Gabinius about Antony's performance at Pelusium. Caesar assigned him to the tribunicial staff, a position that placed him among the 6 military tribunes attached to each legion, though in practice Caesar used them flexibly across his forces. The camps Antony now entered followed a standard layout. A rectangular ditch and rampart enclosed the area, with gates at each side. Inside, streets divided the space into neat sections. Headquarters at the centre, tribunes' tents nearby, legionary cohorts in ordered rows, and auxiliaries on the perimeter. The smell of wood smoke rose from cooking fires morning and evening. Men ate twice a day porridge or bread with bacon in the morning, a heavier meal of stewed meat or vegetables later. Water came from nearby streams or wells, sometimes tasting of iron or mud. Antony's duties included supervising training, inspecting equipment, and carrying orders between units. He learned the legion's daily routine quickly. At dawn, trumpets sounded for roll call. Men polished helmets and shields, repaired sandals and sharpened blades with whetstones. Drills involved forming the testudo for siege work, practicing javelin throws, or marching in column with full packs weighing 60 pounds or more. Antony drilled alongside the men, sharing their pace on long marches and their discomfort in rain or cold. He observed Caesar's methods at close range. The general rose early, dictated letters to secretaries, reviewed intelligence from scouts, and met with Gallic envoys who arrived on horseback with gifts of cattle or grain. Caesar spoke Latin clearly and directly, switching to Greek when needed for Eastern visitors. He ate sparingly, often standing while he worked, and slept little during active campaigns. Antony adopted some of these habits, though he kept his evenings freer, sharing wine with fellow officers around campfires. The year 54 BC brought heavy fighting in northern Gaul. Ambiorix, a leader of the Eburones, ambushed a legion under Sabinus and Cotta, wiping it out in the Ardennes forests. Caesar responded with rapid marches to punish the tribes involved. Antony took part in the punitive expeditions. Columns moved through dense woodland where paths narrowed and rain turned tracks to mud. Soldiers felled trees to clear routes, built bridges over swollen streams, and kept watch for ambushes. Supplies travelled on mule trains, and when food ran short, men slaughtered pack animals or foraged for grain in native villages. In one action, Antony led a detachment of cavalry in pursuit of fleeing tribesmen. The chase covered open fields and river crossings, with horses tiring and men shouting to maintain formation. They captured prisoners and recovered standards lost in earlier defeats. Such operations brought personal rewards, gold talks, silver coins, and slaves taken as booty. Antony sent portions back to Rome to settle lingering debts and to support his household. Winter quarters in Gaul offered a change of pace. Legions settled in fortified camps near rivers like the Sambre or Moselle. Officers built more substantial huts with thatched roofs and clay hearths. Antony shared quarters with other tribunes, where they played board games, discussed politics, and wrote letters home. Local Gauls traded grain, cattle, and timber for Roman goods, wine, pottery, and metalwork. Markets sprang up outside the gates, with native women selling bread and cheese to soldiers who paid in small bronze coins. Antony maintained contact with Rome through messengers and occasional trips south. He heard about the death of his wife, Antonia, his first marriage, arranged earlier, and the political manoeuvring in the city. Pompey and Crassus held the consulship in 55 BC, but their alliance with Caesar showed strains. Clodius and Milo continued their street battles, and Caesar's daughter Julia, Pompey's wife, died in 54 BC, weakening the personal ties between the two men. Caesar kept Antony busy with varied tasks. He served as quaestor in some records, though his main role remained military. He commanded detachments on reconnaissance, escorted supply trains, and participated in engineering work building bridges, siege ramps, or fortified lines. The bridge over the Rhine in 55 BC and again in 53 BC impressed him. Wooden piles driven into the riverbed, crossbeams lashed together, and a roadway laid in days. Antony crossed it with the legions, seeing the German bank for the first time, dense forests, scattered farms, and tribes watching from a distance. By 52 BC, the Gallic revolt under Vercingetorix brought the hardest fighting. Caesar faced a united opposition across central Gaul. Antony fought in several engagements, including the siege of Avaricum, where legions stormed the town after a long investment. Smoke from burning houses filled the air, and the streets ran with defenders and civilians. He also took part in the relief of Gergovia, where Caesar suffered a rare setback, losing men in a failed assault on the hilltop fortress. The climactic siege at Alesia in 52 BC saw Antony among the officers directing operations. Caesar built double lines of fortification, circumvallation to trap Vercingetorix inside, contravallation to fend off the relieving army. Antony commanded sections of the line, overseeing archers, slingers, and artillery crews. The final battle came when Gallic reinforcements attacked the Roman works. Antony led countercharges with cavalry, riding through gaps in the defences to strike enemy columns. The fighting lasted all day, with dust, blood, and the constant sound of weapons. Caesar's victory broke the revolt. After Alesia, Gaul submitted. Caesar distributed rewards generously. Antony received promotions, wealth from booty, and a stronger position in the general's circle. He had learned the mechanics of large-scale warfare, logistics, engineering, morale, and the use of combined arms. He also absorbed Caesar's style of leadership, swift decisions, personal example, and calculated mercy toward defeated enemies. As the Gallic campaigns wound down, Antony's thoughts turned toward Rome. Caesar planned to stand for consul again, and tensions with the Senate grew. Antony, now seasoned and loyal, prepared to follow his patron into the next phase. The Rubicon waited in the future, but for the moment, the frontier camps and marching roads had shaped him into a commander Caesar trusted. Tribune in civil strife, the Gallic campaigns had given Antony a solid military record and Caesar's confidence by early 50 BC. Caesar, now nearing the end of his provincial command, needed loyal men in Rome to protect his interests while he prepared to return. Antony, at around 33 years old, returned to the city with funds from Gaul, enough to clear remaining debts and establish himself more comfortably. He took up residence again in a family property, perhaps on the Caelian, where he could receive clients and plan his next steps. Caesar arranged for Antony to stand for election as tribune of the plebes for the year 49 BC. The position carried significant power, the right to veto Senate decrees, propose laws directly to the people, and offer personal protection to citizens against magistrates. Tribunes traditionally came from plebeian families or those who had been adopted into them, and Antony's background qualified him. Caesar's backing, combined with his own recent reputation as a capable officer, helped secure the election despite opposition from Pompey's supporters in the Senate. Rome, in the late 50s BC, had become a place of open tension. The streets saw more frequent clashes between armed bands, loyal to different leaders. Pompey held formal command in the city as consul without a colleague after 52 BC, backed by many senators who feared Caesar's growing power. Grain supplies fluctuated, causing price spikes that affected the urban poor. People queued at the distribution points on the Aventine or near the Porticus Minutia, receiving monthly allotments of wheat measured out in wooden tokens. Bakers worked longer hours, and taverns filled with men discussing the latest Senate debates or rumours from Gaul. Antony entered the Tribunes' College on December 10, 50 BC, when the new term began. The 10 tribunes shared an office near the Forum, a modest building with a portico where they met to discuss business. Each had a lictor, carrying the fasces as a symbol of authority. Antony wore the plain toga of office, edged in purple, and carried himself with the assurance gained from years in the field. He quickly aligned with the 2 other tribunes most favourable to Caesar, Gaius Cassius Longinus and Quintus Cassius Longinus, though the latter was a different man from the conspirator. The Senate, dominated by Pompey's allies, debated Caesar's command repeatedly. Many senators wanted him to disband his legions and return as a private citizen to face possible prosecution for earlier actions. Caesar insisted on standing for consul in absentia, as he had been promised. The debates grew heated in the Curia, with speakers shouting across the benches and attendants struggling to maintain order. Outside, crowds gathered in the Forum, listening to heralds read out proposals or watching for signs of violence. Antony used his veto power several times in late 50 and early 49 BC to block measures that would strip Caesar of his provinces or force him to disband his army without guarantees. Each veto required him to stand before the Senate and declare intercessio, or simply veto. The word halted proceedings immediately, frustrating Pompey's faction. Senators grumbled that Antony acted as Caesar's mouthpiece rather than an independent magistrate. Some accused him of accepting bribes, though no proof emerged beyond the general suspicion that surrounded all such politics. By January 49 BC, the situation reached a breaking point. The Senate passed the Senatus Consultum Ultimum, granting consuls and other magistrates broad powers to protect the state. This decree effectively suspended normal procedures and allowed Pompey to raise troops in Italy. Antony and his fellow tribune Quintus Cassius, fearing for their safety, disguised themselves as slaves or couriers and fled the city at night. They slipped out through a side gate, avoiding the main roads patrolled by Pompey's men, and rode hard towards Caesar's winter quarters near Ravenna. The journey took several days through wintry conditions. Snow lay in the Apennine passes, and roads turned to mud under hoof and wheel. They changed horses at posting stations, ate quickly at roadside inns serving hot stew and mulled wine, and slept in short stretches. Along the way they passed villages where farmers watched them curiously, uncertain whether they were messengers of war or ordinary travellers. The air smelled of wood smoke from hearth fires and wet earth after rain. They reached Caesar near the Rubicon River, the traditional boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy proper. Caesar had assembled his forces Legion the 13th and auxiliaries on the far bank. Antony and Cassius delivered their account of events in Rome. The Senate's decree, the threats against the tribunes, and the flight from the city. Caesar addressed his troops in the open, explaining the insult to the tribunician office and the danger to the Republic. The soldiers, many of whom had served with him for years, cheered and demanded to march. Caesar crossed the Rubicon on the night of January 10, 49 BC, with a small force. The river ran shallow at the ford, its waters cold and clear. Antony rode with the advance guard, watching the dark shapes of men and horses move through the stream. No large opposition awaited on the other side. The nearest Pompeian garrisons lay farther south. The crossing became the decisive act, though at the time it felt more like a calculated step than a dramatic plunge. The march south began immediately. Caesar moved quickly to secure Ariminum, Rimini, the first major town inside Italy. Citizens opened the gates without resistance, and the legionaries took up positions along the walls. Antony helped organize billets in private homes and public buildings, ensuring supplies flowed from local markets. Bread, wine, and fodder appeared in quantity as townspeople sought to avoid trouble. Rumours spread rapidly along the coast. Caesar had entered Italy. The tribunes had been driven out. Civil war had begun. Pompey and the Senate abandoned Rome in haste. Senators fled south to Capua and then Brundisium, taking treasury funds and records with them. The city emptied of many leading families. Streets grew quieter, though the urban population remained, watching events unfold. Caesar advanced down the Adriatic coast, taking town after town with little fighting. Corfinium fell after a short siege, where Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus surrendered his forces. Caesar released the prisoners unharmed, a gesture meant to encourage further defections. Antony received command of a legion during these early months. He led detachments to secure Picenum and the eastern routes, moving through hilly country where olive groves and vineyards lined the roads. Local inhabitants provided intelligence and supplies, often willingly after seeing Caesar's clemency. Antony enforced strict discipline, no looting, prompt payment for goods to maintain goodwill. By spring 49 BC, Caesar controlled most of Italy north of Rome. Pompey withdrew to Brundisium to evacuate his forces to Greece. Caesar pursued, reaching the port before Pompey could fully embark. Antony participated in the blockade, commanding troops along the shore and harassing Pompeian ships with small boats. Pompey escaped with part of his army, but Caesar chose not to risk a naval chase without a fleet. With Italy secured, Caesar turned west to Spain to deal with Pompeian governors there. He left Antony in charge of Italy as propraetor, though the formal title varied in sources. Antony governed from Rome or nearby, managing the city and provinces under Caesar's direction. He oversaw grain distributions to prevent unrest, dealt with debt issues that had long troubled the urban population, and kept order amid the uncertainty of war. The role exposed him to the administrative side of power. He received petitions from citizens, heard disputes, and issued edicts. The Forum saw fewer grand debates but more practical business: auctions of confiscated property, registration of veterans, and arrangements for Caesar's eventual return. Antony lived in Caesar's house on the Palatine during this period, using it as a base for meetings and correspondence. The year 49 BC closed with Caesar victorious in Spain and preparing to follow Pompey east. Antony remained in Italy, holding the city and preparing for the next phase. The streets of Rome, once filled with the noise of rival gangs, now carried the quieter tension of a state at war with itself. People adapted to the new reality, buying their daily needs, attending temples, and waiting to see how the conflict would resolve. Pharsalus, an Italian ruler Caesar, left for Greece early in 48 BC, taking 7 legions with him in a winter crossing of the Adriatic that carried real risk from Pompey's fleet. Antony remained in Italy to finish recruiting, gather supplies, and bring the rest of the army across when conditions allowed. The port at Brundisium became his main base for weeks. He inspected ships being fitted out, watched sailors load grain sacks and wine barrels, and made sure the troops had cloaks, sandals, and enough rations for the voyage. The men drilled on the shore while Antony walked the lines, checking weapons and listening to centurions report on readiness. Italy felt the war's pressure everywhere. Trade had slowed, and grain ships from Sicily and Africa reached Ostia less often. In Rome, the monthly wheat dole turned into a source of worry for thousands of families. Citizens gathered at the distribution points along the Tiber, holding their tokens and baskets while clerks measured out the grain. When supplies ran short, the portions grew smaller, and people went home to stretch meals with barley porridge or vegetables from garden plots outside the walls. The streets around the Forum and in the Subura carried quiet talk about higher bread prices and how the fighting was making ordinary life harder. Mothers adjusted recipes, fathers calculated household expenses, and children learned to eat less at supper. Antony worked from Caesar's house on the Palatine. Messengers brought daily reports, and he issued orders for taxes, troop movements, and debt cases. He travelled often to Brundisium, eating the same hard bread and watered wine as the soldiers to show he shared their conditions. The responsibility weighed on him. He knew failure to deliver the reinforcements could weaken Caesar's position. His ambition to prove his worth grew, but he also felt the fear that the Republic itself might fracture beyond repair. By March he had 3 legions and auxiliaries ready. The fleet sailed at night to avoid enemy patrols. The crossing lasted several days with strong winds forcing occasional shelter in coastal bays. Men rowed when sails failed, and Antony moved among them, offering water from his flask and words of encouragement. The ships landed safely in Greece, and the troops joined Caesar near Dyrrhachium. The camp there stretched for miles behind earthworks and ditches. Caesar greeted the arrival with approval, and the 2 men reviewed plans for the coming battle. The armies faced each other at Pharsalus in Thessaly in August. The plain was open and flat, with low hills on one side and the Enipeus River on the other. Pompey held a larger force and placed his best cavalry on his right wing. Caesar put Antony in command of the left, facing that threat. The morning began with the usual preparations: quick breakfasts of bread and water, final sharpening of blades, and lines forming 3 deep. Heat rose quickly, and dust lifted from the dry grass as the legions advanced. Caesar's right wing moved first under his direct lead. The centre infantry met with the clash of shields and swords. Antony's left held firm when Pompey's cavalry charged. Javelins flew, horses reared, and the first wave was turned back. Caesar's hidden 4th line of infantry then struck the cavalry from the side, causing confusion. Antony saw the opening and advanced his legions, pressing the enemy flank in steady steps. The fighting continued for hours under the hot sun, with units shifting and men calling to hold formation. Antony rode along the line, directing reserves where gaps appeared. The pressure from all sides finally broke the Pompeian ranks. Soldiers threw down their arms and ran toward the hills. The victory was total. Pompey escaped the field and later died in Egypt. Caesar showed mercy to the prisoners, inviting many to join his army. Antony helped organize care for the wounded, collection of weapons, and burial of the dead. The camp received extra rations that night, and soldiers shared stories around the fires while Antony kept his own celebration quiet and focused on the next tasks. Caesar soon departed for Egypt. He named Antony Master of the Horse, giving him authority to govern Italy and the West in his absence. Antony returned with part of the army and reached Rome by late 48 BC. The city heard the news of Pharsalus with relief, but daily problems had not vanished. As Master of the Horse, Antony held wide powers to issue edicts and command troops. He took up official quarters and turned first to the debt crisis. Many citizens had borrowed at high rates during the war. Creditors pressed hard, and courts were overloaded. Antony issued edicts allowing debtors to settle at pre-war property values or in installments. Shopkeepers and small farmers who had feared losing everything gained breathing room. One man from the Suburra came with a petition explaining how war had ruined his business. Antony granted relief after hearing the details. Creditors resented the changes and spoke against them in the Senate. Veteran demands added another layer. Caesar had promised land to those who served in Gaul and the Civil War. Antony arranged settlements across Italy, sending surveyors to divide plots and providing tools and seed. Some veterans settled without trouble, but in other districts existing owners protested. Antony sent small detachments to keep order while trying to balance both sides. Food shortages still touched ordinary families. Grain stores stayed low from disrupted farming and shipping. Antony ordered more cargoes from Africa and Sicily and checked unloading at Ostia himself. In Rome, he visited the granaries to see stocks and watched the dole lines. Portions became steadier, but the memory of empty shelves lingered. A widow on the Aventine with 3 children once relied entirely on the ration. When it fell short, she borrowed from neighbours or sold clothing. Gradual improvements eased such cases, though not completely. Antony's habits showed during these months. He hosted dinners with officers and old friends like Curio, where wine passed freely and talk turned to past campaigns. His drinking drew notice, and rumours of late nights spread, yet he rose early for meetings and kept administration moving. He met petitioners in the atrium, listening to complaints about taxes and land. Slaves managed household routines, preparing simple meals of porridge, cheese and vegetables, while freedmen handled letters. Senate rivals watched closely. Some pointed to unrest in veteran colonies or to Antony's social life as signs of weak control. He answered by staying loyal to Caesar and handling problems practically. Common people held mixed feelings. Many appreciated debt relief and steadier grain supplies. Others worried the city lacked full stability. Daily life continued with familiar patterns. People wore wool tunics and cloaks according to the season, visited temples for sacrifices, and attended games when held. Markets stayed busy with pottery, cloth and food stalls, though buyers haggled more carefully. Families adapted, sharing news at fountains and adjusting to the new governor. Antony kept the peace, putting down small disturbances and maintaining supply routes. He walked the markets to observe prices and speak with vendors. When Caesar returned in 47 BC, the worst of the crisis had passed. Antony handed over duties, and attention turned to remaining Pompeian forces in Africa. The experience had taught him about governance in peacetime, revealing both his skill at organization and the personal tendencies that could create difficulties later. Consul with Caesar, returned to Rome in October 47 BC after settling affairs in Egypt and Asia Minor. The city welcomed him with formal processions and Senate decrees granting honours, though many leading families remained cautious. Antony had maintained order during the absence, and Caesar expressed satisfaction with the administration. Debt relief measures had eased tensions among the urban classes, veteran settlements progressed in parts of Italy, and the grain supply had stabilized enough to prevent major unrest. Caesar decided to reward loyalty by naming Antony his colleague in the consulship for 44 BC. The appointment came as no surprise. Antony's family tie, military record in Gaul and the Civil War, and recent governance in Italy made him a natural choice. The two men took office on January 1, 44 BC. Consuls shared the highest civil and military authority in Rome, presiding over the Senate, commanding armies when needed, and overseeing religious ceremonies. Caesar, as dictator perpetuo since the previous year, held overriding power, but the consulship gave Antony formal standing and public visibility. Daily routines in the consulship followed established patterns. Mornings often began with the salutatio in Caesar's house on the Palatine, where clients and senators arrived to offer greetings. Antony attended these sessions, standing near Caesar while petitions were presented, requests for citizenship, tax reductions, or appointments in the provinces. After the formalities, the consuls moved to the forum or curia for Senate meetings. The Senate house, rebuilt after earlier fires, had marble benches arranged in tiers, with Caesar's golden curule chair at the front. Senators entered in togas with purple borders, took seats according to rank, and debated proposals read by a herald. Antony spoke when called upon, supporting Caesar's measures with clear arguments drawn from practical experience. He advocated land distributions for veterans, extensions of citizenship to provincials, and reforms to the calendar that Caesar had already begun. The Julian calendar, introduced the previous year, adjusted the year to 365 days with a leap day every 4 years. Priests and farmers in the countryside gradually adopted the new system, marking festivals and planting seasons by the revised dates rather than the old lunar one. Public life in Rome showed signs of returning normalcy under the new regime. Markets along the Via Sacra and Argiletum sold goods from across the empire. Spanish olive oil in amphorae, Gallic wool, Egyptian papyrus, and spices from Arabia. Vendors called out prices, customers haggled in Latin or Greek, and coins changed hands in steady streams. The smell of fresh bread, roasting chestnuts, and incense from nearby temples drifted through the air. People wore tunics suited to the season linen in warmer months, heavier wool in winter, and cloaks pinned at the shoulder for men, stolas for women of higher status. Antony maintained his personal habits. He kept a household staff that included freedmen for correspondence and slaves for daily tasks. Meals remained simple when alone: porridge, vegetables, and wine, but he hosted dinners for officers and allies, where courses included fish from the Tiber, poultry, and fruits. Wine appeared in quantity, often stronger varieties from Campania or Greece. Guests reclined on couches in the triclinium, and conversation covered military matters, politics, and lighter topics. Antony's drinking drew occasional comment among observers, though it did not yet interfere with official duties. One notable public moment occurred during the Lupercalia festival on February 15, 44 BC. The festival honoured Faunus and involved young men running through the streets in goatskin loincloths, striking passers-by with thongs of goat hide to promote fertility. Antony, as consul and member of the Julian gens, served as one of the Luperci. The runners gathered at the Lupercal cave on the Palatine, sacrificed goats and a dog, smeared blood on their foreheads, and set off along the sacred way. Caesar sat on the rostra in the forum, dressed in his purple-bordered toga and seated on a golden chair. Antony, running with the others, reached the rostra and placed a diadem, a white fillet symbolizing kingship, on Caesar's head. The crowd reacted with mixed sounds, some silence, some applause, some disapproval. Caesar pushed the diadem away, and Antony offered it again. Caesar refused once more, directing it to be taken to the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline as more fitting for a god than a man. The gesture, whether planned or spontaneous, became widely discussed. Some saw it as a test of public feeling toward monarchy. Others viewed it as Antony's initiative to flatter Caesar or provoke a reaction. Senate sessions continued through the winter and early spring. Caesar proposed further reforms, enlarging the Senate to include provincials, adjusting provincial commands, and planning colonies for veterans in Gaul and Spain. Antony supported these openly, speaking in favour when debates arose. He also handled routine consular business, presiding over trials, supervising public works, and receiving foreign envoys who arrived with gifts and requests. The city bustled with activity. Construction continued on Caesar's new forum, with marble columns rising and statues being placed. Temples received offerings after recent victories, and priests conducted sacrifices on appointed days. The Tiber carried barges loaded with building stone and grain, and porters moved goods through narrow streets. Children played near fountains, women fetched water in bronze jars, and men gathered in barber shops for shaves and news. Antony's personal life included a second marriage to Fulvia, a woman of strong character and political connections. She managed household affairs and influenced decisions through her network. Their home saw visitors from across the social scale, senators seeking favours, veterans requesting land grants, and friends from earlier years. Antony balanced these domestic matters with public duties, often rising early to review documents before the day's obligations. As spring advanced, Caesar prepared for a major campaign against Parthia to avenge Crassus's defeat at Carrhae. He planned to leave in March, leaving consuls and magistrates to govern in his absence. Antony expected a prominent role in the expedition, perhaps commanding cavalry or a legion. Preparations included mustering troops in Italy, gathering supplies, and appointing deputies. On the morning of March 15, 44 BC, Caesar set out for the Senate meeting in the theatre of Pompey. Antony accompanied him part of the way but was detained outside by a conversation with Trebonius, one of the conspirators. Caesar entered the chamber alone. Senators rose in respect, then surrounded him under pretense of a petition. Daggers appeared, and the attack came swiftly. Caesar fell at the base of Pompey's statue, wounded 23 times. Antony was still outside when the commotion began. He heard shouts and saw senators fleeing in disorder. Some rushed past him, togas dishevelled, faces pale, others stood stunned. Antony realized the danger and slipped away quickly, avoiding the immediate area. He returned home under cover, changed clothing, and assessed the situation through messengers. The city reacted with shock and fear. People locked doors, closed shops, and watched from windows as armed men appeared in the streets. Rumours spread that Caesar's death would bring chaos or a return to old republican rule. Antony, as surviving consul, gathered his household guards and waited for developments. The conspirators led by Brutus and Cassius held the Capitoline with gladiators, expecting support that did not fully materialize. Antony moved carefully in the following days. He secured Caesar's papers, treasury access, and military loyalty. On March 17, the Senate met again and granted amnesty to the assassins while confirming Caesar's acts. Antony spoke in favour of compromise, urging peace to prevent further civil war. The decision allowed a fragile calm to settle. On March 20, Caesar's body lay in state in the Forum. Antony delivered the funeral oration from the rostra. He read the will, leaving bequests to citizens and gardens to the people, and recounted Caesar's achievements. The crowd grew emotional, and when the body was carried to cremation, fires started in nearby buildings. Antony withdrew as the flames rose, letting the city's anger express itself. In the weeks that followed, Antony consolidated his position. He controlled Caesar's documents, including the will and appointment lists. He summoned legions from outside the city and prepared to defend his authority. The period marked the end of one phase and the beginning of sharper conflict. Antony, now at the centre of events, faced choices that would shape the rest of his life. Ides of March aftermath. The hours immediately following Caesar's assassination on March 15, 44 BC unfolded in confusion and rapid movement. Antony had been kept outside the Senate chamber in the theatre of Pompey by Trebonius, who engaged him in conversation under some pretext. When the shouts and commotion began inside, Antony understood at once what had happened. He did not linger. With a few attendants, he moved quickly away from the building, avoiding the main exits where senators were fleeing in disarray. Some ran past him with togas torn or blood on their hands. Others stood frozen, staring at the doors. He reached his house on the Palatine without incident, though the streets had begun to empty as people heard the news. Doors slammed shut, shutters closed, and the usual afternoon traffic of carts and pedestrians thinned to almost nothing. Antony changed out of his consular toga into plainer clothing, gathered a small bodyguard of loyal veterans and freedmen, and sent messengers to trusted officers and friends. The city remained quiet at first, no immediate looting, no crowds in the forum, but an undercurrent of fear spread through every neighbourhood. That night, Antony stayed indoors, receiving reports from those who ventured out. The conspirators Brutus, Cassius, Decimus Brutus, and others had retreated to the Capitoline Hill with a force of gladiators borrowed from a theatrical troupe. They fortified the temple area and sent word that they acted to restore the Republic and protect liberty from tyranny. They expected popular support and hoped other senators would join them. Antony learned that Lepidus, Caesar's master of horse and commander of troops outside the city, had moved a legion closer to Rome but had not yet committed to any side. The next day, March 16, Antony remained cautious. He avoided public appearances and continued to gather information. Caesar's papers and personal seal had been left in the hands of Calpurnia, Caesar's wife, who had taken them to the house of the Vestal Virgins for safekeeping. Antony sent discreet envoys to her and arranged to take possession of the documents. Among them were Caesar's will, appointment lists for provincial governors, and records of financial arrangements. Control of these gave Antony immediate leverage. By March 17, the Senate met again, this time in the Temple of Tellus on the Carinae, to avoid the open forum. Antony attended as consul, wearing mourning for Caesar, but speaking with measured calm. The atmosphere was tense. Conspirators and their supporters sat on one side, Caesar's loyalists on the other. Cicero, who had not been part of the plot but approved of it, proposed a general amnesty, no prosecutions for the killing, and confirmation of all Caesar's acts to preserve order. Antony supported the proposal. He argued that further bloodshed would destroy what remained of the state, and that compromise offered the only path to stability. The Senate voted in favour. The decree passed, granting the assassins immunity while upholding Caesar's laws, colonies, and appointments. Antony gained from the settlement. As surviving consul, he retained legitimate authority. He secured the treasury keys and access to the state funds Caesar had controlled. He also took charge of Caesar's military clients' legions, still loyal to the dictator's memory, and began corresponding with provincial governors to confirm their loyalty. In the days that followed, he moved through the city with a larger escort, showing himself in the forum to demonstrate that order persisted. Public feeling shifted slowly. At first, many citizens stayed indoors fearing reprisals. Shops opened only partially, and markets saw fewer customers. The urban plebs, who had benefited from Caesar's grain distributions and land promises, reacted with anger rather than celebration. Small groups gathered near the rostra, discussing the murder and cursing the conspirators. Antony kept watch on these gatherings but did not suppress them outright. He understood that popular sentiment could become a weapon. On March 20, Caesar's body was brought to the forum for the public funeral. Antony arranged the proceedings. The body lay on an ivory couch draped in purple and gold, surrounded by trophies from Caesar's victory standards, weapons, and models of captured cities. Antony ascended the rostra to deliver the eulogy. He read the will aloud, 300 sesterces to each citizen, Caesar's gardens on the Janiculum to the people as a public park, and the appointment of guardians for his adopted son Octavius. The reading provoked murmurs of approval and growing resentment toward the assassins. Antony then recounted Caesar's career, the conquests in Gaul, the civil war victories, the clemency toward defeated enemies. He displayed Caesar's blood-stained toga, pointing to the rents made by the daggers. The crowd's emotion rose. Some shouted for vengeance. Others wept openly. When the body was carried toward the cremation site near the Campus Martius, the procession turned chaotic. Mourners seized benches, shop signs, and anything wooden from nearby buildings to build the pyre. Fires started in the forum itself, damaging the curia and adjacent structures. Antony withdrew from the scene as the flames grew, allowing the crowd's anger to burn itself out. In the following weeks, Antony consolidated his position. He summoned Caesar's veterans from their colonies in Italy and stationed loyal legions near the city. He issued edicts as consul, confirming Caesar's acts and promising to honour the will's bequests. The treasury paid out the 300 sesterces per citizen in instalments, which helped calm the urban poor. Antony also negotiated with the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius left Rome quietly for their assigned provinces. Crete and Cyrene, though they soon began raising support elsewhere. Octavius, Caesar's great-nephew and adopted heir, arrived in Rome in April. At 18 he was young but already showed political instinct. He took the name Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus and presented himself to Antony. The two met several times. Antony controlled the practical tools of power troops, funds, and Caesar's papers, while Octavian held the name and the will's legitimacy. Their early interactions were polite but guarded. Antony treated the young man as a junior, offering advice and access to documents, but kept real authority in his own hands. The summer of 44 BC saw Antony manoeuvring to secure his future. He secured the province of Cisalpine Gaul for the following year through a law passed by the plebs overriding Senate assignments. The command gave him a legionary base close to Italy. He recruited more troops, drawing on veterans who still wore Caesar's name on their standards. In Rome he continued consular duties, presiding over courts, supervising public works, and receiving petitions. The city gradually returned to its routines, markets reopened fully, temples held regular sacrifices, and people resumed daily business, but an underlying tension remained. Antony's personal life reflected the strain. He spent evenings with friends and officers, drinking wine and discussing strategy. Fulvia, his wife, played an active role, using her connections to gather information and rally support. Rumours circulated about Antony's lifestyle, late nights, theatrical companions, but he maintained enough discipline to keep administration functioning. By autumn, the political landscape had shifted again. Octavian began building his own following among veterans and the urban plebs. Cicero, initially neutral, turned against Antony in a series of speeches known as the Philippics, accusing him of corruption and ambition. Antony responded in the Senate and public meetings, defending his actions and attacking his critics. The exchanges grew sharper, dividing the Senate and the city. Antony prepared to leave for his province in November. He took several legions north, leaving Rome under the nominal authority of the remaining magistrates. The departure marked the end of his direct control over the city, but he retained influence through allies and the loyalty of Caesar's veterans. The months after the Ides had transformed him from consul to a major player in the emerging power struggle. He had secured funds, troops, and legitimacy while the conspirators scattered and Octavian rose. The path ahead pointed toward open conflict. But for the moment, Antony held a strong position in a republic that no longer functioned as it once had. Triumvirate and Proscription Antony left Rome in November 44 BC with several legions and headed north to take possession of Cisalpine Gaul, the province the plebs had assigned him by law. The march passed through familiar Italian countryside, rolling hills, olive groves, and small towns where inhabitants watched the columns pass from doorways and rooftops. He stopped at key points to secure loyalty from local garrisons and veteran colonies. Decimus Brutus, one of the assassins, already held the province as governor and refused to yield. Antony besieged Mutina, where Decimus had withdrawn with his troops. The siege lasted through the winter into early 43 BC, with Antony's forces building earthworks and cutting supply lines while Decimus waited for relief from the Senate. The Senate, now under Cicero's strong influence, declared Antony a public enemy in February 43 BC. They sent the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, along with young Octavian, to relieve Mutina. Fighting occurred near Forum Gallorum and Mutina in April. Antony's troops clashed with the consular armies in marshy ground and along roads. Both consuls died in the engagements, Hirtius in the first battle, Pansa from wounds in the second. Octavian's forces held the field at the end, and Decimus escaped the siege. Antony withdrew his army across the Alps into Transalpine Gaul to regroup, suffering losses but preserving the core of his legions. During these months, Octavian manoeuvred skillfully. After the victories at Mutina, the Senate granted him a triumph and the title Imperator, but refused him the consulship he sought despite his age. Octavian turned his legions around, marched on Rome, and forced the Senate to elect him consul suffect in August 43 BC. With legal authority secured, he began looking for allies against the remaining liberators, Brutus and Cassius, who had raised large armies in the east. Antony, meanwhile, had linked up with Lepidus, governor of Transalpine Gaul and nearer Spain. Lepidus commanded several legions and controlled key passes. The two met near modern Lyon in May 43 BC. Their soldiers fraternized across the lines, refusing to fight each other. Lepidus mediated, and the three men, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, agreed to meet on an island in a river near Bologna, in October 43 BC. The conference lasted several days. Guards patrolled the banks while the three leaders talked in a tent on the island. They formed what history calls the Second Triumvirate, a formal alliance for 5 years to restore the Republic. The legal basis came from a Lex Titia, passed by the plebs in November 43 BC, granting them dictatorial powers to make laws, appoint magistrates, and divide the provinces. Antony took Gaul, Lepidus Spain and parts of Gaul, and Octavian Africa, Sicily and Sardinia. They agreed to proscribe enemies to raise funds for the coming war against Brutus and Cassius. The proscription lists were drawn up in late 43 BC. The three men sat together for days, adding names. Cicero topped the list for his role in the Philippics and Senate opposition. Family members, friends, and wealthy men followed senators, equites, and even some who had simply offended one of the triumvirs. The total reached around 300 senators and 2,000 equites. Rewards were offered for heads or information leading to capture: 25,000 denarii for a senator, 10,000 for an equite, with immunity for the informer. The lists were posted in the Forum in November 43 BC. The city fell into terror. People checked the boards daily, searching for familiar names. Those proscribed fled if they could, some to the countryside, others to Brutus or Cassius in the east. Many were betrayed by slaves, freedmen, or neighbours hoping for the reward. Houses were searched at night. Streets saw armed bands hunting fugitives. Wives and children hid relatives or helped them escape over walls and through gardens. Cicero was caught near his villa at Formiae. He had tried to reach a ship but returned when seas were rough. Soldiers found him in a litter carried by freedmen. He offered no resistance. His head and hands were cut off and taken to Rome. Antony displayed them on the rostra, where Cicero had so often spoken. Fulvia, Antony's wife, reportedly pierced the tongue with a hairpin in private revenge for the speeches against her husband. The proscriptions brought in enormous wealth. Estates, houses, slaves, and money were confiscated and sold at auction. The triumvirs used the funds to pay their troops bonuses, 5,000 denarii per soldier, and to equip the army for the east. In Rome, the auctions filled the forum with bidders, many of them freedmen or soldiers who had received rewards. Prices stayed low because fear kept genuine buyers away. Families lost everything. Widows and orphans appeared in the streets begging or seeking shelter with relatives. Daily life in the city changed under the shadow of the lists. Markets remained open but quieter, with fewer luxury goods. People avoided public gatherings, spoke carefully in taverns, and locked doors at dusk. The smell of fear mixed with the usual scents of bread ovens and Tiber mud. Children learned to stay indoors. Women carried messages in secret to help hidden kin. Some proscribed men disguised themselves as slaves or labourers and survived in the Subura's back alleys. Antony spent part of late 43 BC in Rome overseeing the process. He lived in Caesar's old house on the Palatine, now fortified with guards. He met with Lepidus and Octavian to divide the spoils and plan the campaign. Octavian handled many of the executions in Rome, while Antony focused on military preparations. Lepidus took a lesser role, content with his provinces. By early 42 BC, the triumvirs had raised 19 legions and auxiliary forces. They crossed the Adriatic in spring, landing in Greece and marching east to confront Brutus and Cassius. Antony led the advance, with Octavian following after settling affairs in Italy. The army moved through Macedonia and Thrace, requisitioning grain and supplies from local towns. Villages provided fodder and water, roads filled with mule trains carrying tents, weapons, and siege equipment. The campaign culminated at Philippi in Macedonia in October 42 BC. Antony commanded the left wing opposite Cassius, Octavian the right against Brutus. The two battles occurred on successive days. In the first, Antony's forces broke through Cassius's lines after hard fighting in marshy ground. Cassius, misinformed that Brutus had lost, took his own life. The second battle saw Brutus's army defeated after a long struggle. Brutus died by suicide. The triumvirs had won decisively. After Philippi, Antony took the eastern provinces, Asia Minor, Syria, and the richer commands, while Octavian returned west to settle veterans and manage Italy. Lepidus received Africa, but with reduced influence. Antony stayed in the east to reorganize the provinces and collect funds to pay the troops. The victory secured his power, but left deep scars in Rome. The proscriptions had eliminated many old families and shifted wealth dramatically. The Republic's traditional elite had been weakened, and the path to sole rule lay open, though not yet clear. In the months after Philippi, Antony entered Asia Minor. Cities welcomed him with processions and honours, hoping for leniency after supporting the liberators. He wintered in Athens and other Greek centres, adjusting taxes and rewarding loyal communities. The experience introduced him to Eastern administration on a larger scale, tribute collection, local councils, and the customs of Hellenistic cities. He began to adopt some of the styles and habits that would later define his rule in the East. Philippi campaign victory. The march east began in spring 42 BC once the legions had been paid, their bonuses from the proscription money, and the ships assembled at Brundisium. Antony took the lead with the main body of troops, crossing the Adriatic in a fleet of transport vessels escorted by lighter warships. The voyage lasted several days under variable winds, with men packed tightly below decks or on open benches. They ate hard biscuit and salted pork, drank water from barrels that grew stale, and slept in shifts to keep watch for enemy sails. Landing near Dyrrachium, the soldiers formed up again on Greek soil, their boots still damp from the sea crossing. The route led through Macedonia, following old Roman roads and native tracks that wound past olive groves, wheat fields, and small villages where locals watched the columns pass. Supply trains stretched for miles behind the infantry, mules carrying tents, grain sacks, and replacement weapons. Antony rode near the front each day, checking on the pace and stopping to speak with centurions about water sources and forage. The army moved 20 miles on good days, less when rain turned the ground soft or when scouts reported possible ambushes. Nights brought camp routines, ditches dug, ramparts raised, fires lit for cooking porridge or stew. The men grumbled about the distance but kept formation, their shields and packs heavier with each week on the road. Brutus and Cassius had gathered their forces farther east, drawing from the provinces they controlled. Their army included Roman legions, cavalry from Thrace and Galatia, and light troops familiar with the terrain. The two sides approached Philippi, a town on a plain flanked by hills and marshes. The ground favoured defence in places, with narrow passes and wet lowlands that slowed heavy infantry. Antony chose his camp on the western side, Octavian on the adjacent ground. The soldiers built strong earthworks and waited for the enemy to make the first move. The first battle came on October 3. Antony commanded the left wing, facing Cassius directly. The morning started with the usual trumpet calls and quick rations of bread and water. Lines formed 3 deep across the plain, standards raised, officers walking the ranks to steady the men. Antony gave the signal to advance after Cassius's cavalry tried a flanking move. The legions stepped forward in steady order, javelins ready. When the lines met, the clash echoed across the field, shields banging together, swords striking helmets, shouts rising above the noise. Antony's troops pushed hard through the marshy edge, breaking Cassius's line after hours of fighting. Cassius, seeing his camp overrun from a distance and believing Brutus had lost as well, ended his own life on the spot. The second day brought Brutus's counterattack. Octavian's wing faced the main pressure this time, while Antony shifted reserves to support. The fighting lasted longer, with both sides exhausted from the previous engagement. Men fought in the heat of midday, dust rising from the dry grass. Water skins passed hand to hand between charges. Antony led fresh cohorts into gaps when Brutus's infantry pressed forward, steadying the line until the enemy began to waver. By late afternoon, Brutus's forces broke and retreated toward the hills. Brutus himself withdrew to his tent and took his life when defeat became clear. The victory left the triumvirs in control of the field, but the cost showed in every direction. Wounded soldiers lay among the dead, their bandages stained and voices weak from thirst. The survivors sat on the ground, too tired to celebrate, sharing what little wine remained and tending blisters from the long march. Many had not slept properly for days, others carried injuries that would never fully heal. Antony walked through the camps that evening, speaking to the centurions and promising rest and extra rations once the dead were buried. The men responded with quiet nods rather than cheers. The fighting had drained them more than any Gallic campaign or earlier civil war battle. Prisoners were brought in by the thousands. Antony ordered most of the rank and file released after they swore loyalty, keeping only the officers for later negotiations. Captured standards and weapons were collected and counted. The battlefield itself remained littered for days while burial parties worked, the air heavy with the smell of earth turned over and bodies covered. Soldiers who had marched from Italy now rested in the same tents, their packs lighter but their faces older. With the eastern armies defeated, the triumvirs divided the provinces and responsibilities. Antony received the richer eastern half Gaul, the provinces of Asia, Syria, and the right to settle accounts with the client kings and cities that had supported Brutus and Cassius. Octavian took the western provinces, including Italy, Africa, and Sicily, along with the task of finding land for the veterans. Lepidus kept Africa, but with clearly reduced authority. The agreement was sealed in writing and carried back to Rome by messengers. Antony's share gave him direct control over the wealth of the East and the legions that had fought at Philippi. The army remained in Macedonia for several weeks to recover. Antony arranged shipments of grain from nearby regions and allowed local markets to open near the camp so soldiers could buy extra food or wine. Men wrote letters home when scribes were available, some sending portions of their pay to families in Italy. The rest period helped rebuild strength, though many still carried the weariness of the campaign in their limbs and in their quieter conversations around the fires. From Macedonia, Antony moved south into Greece. He entered Athens with a small escort, where the city offered him honours and he addressed the council in Greek. The winter months that followed were spent adjusting taxes in the Asian provinces and rewarding communities that had stayed loyal or surrendered quickly. Cities like Ephesus and Pergamum sent delegations with gifts, hoping for lighter tribute. Antony reduced some burdens where possible and confirmed local officials who had cooperated. The division of power after Philippi set the lines for the years ahead. Antony, now governed from the east, with access to the wealth of Egypt, Syria, and the Greek cities. Octavian held the west, and the veteran settlements that would shape Italy's future. Lepidus remained in the background. The soldiers who had fought at Philippi received their promised land grants in due course, many settling in colonies across the provinces. Their exhaustion from the campaign gave way to new routines. But the memory of those 2 days on the plain stayed with them, and with Antony as he turned his attention to the administration of his new domain. Meeting Cleopatra in Tarsusin, the spring of 41 BC, Antony moved farther into the eastern provinces to reorganize the administration and collect the funds needed for the legions that had fought at Philippi. He had left Greece behind and entered Asia Minor, where cities like Ephesus and Smyrna sent delegations to meet him with accounts of their finances. The roads carried his column past vineyards and olive groves tended by local farmers who paid their taxes in grain or coin. Antony stopped at each major centre to review records, reduce some burdens where communities had suffered during the Civil War, and confirm governors who had shown loyalty after the defeat of Brutus and Cassius. The soldiers received regular pay from these collections, and many wrote letters home describing the warmer climate and the different markets where they bought extra supplies. The province of Cilicia became his next base. Tarsus served as the main city there, with wide streets laid out in a grid and a river called the Cydnus running through it. Antony established his headquarters in the governor's residence, a building with colonnades and courtyards where clerks worked on papyrus rolls listing tribute payments. Local people in Tarsus wore lighter tunics suited to the heat, and markets sold dates, figs and fish from the river. Antony spent mornings reviewing ledgers with his staff and afternoons meeting with envoys from client kingdoms who arrived on horseback or in litters. The routine felt familiar from his earlier days in Syria, yet the scale had grown with the new provinces under his control. One decision involved Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. She had provided financial support to the liberators during the recent war, and Antony needed her kingdom's wealth to pay the troops and stabilize the east. He sent a formal summons asking her to meet him in Tarsus, to explain her actions and settle accounts. Messengers carried the letter down the coast to Alexandria, travelling by ship for speed. Cleopatra, then 28 years old, prepared her response carefully. She had ruled Egypt for nearly 20 years, first with her brothers and then alone, managing the Nile floods, grain exports, and relations with Rome. She decided to travel in person rather than send representatives. Her arrival at Tarsus in the summer of 41 BC became a memorable event for those who saw it. She approached along the Cydnus River on a barge fitted out with purple sails and silver oars. The vessel moved slowly up the stream, accompanied by smaller boats carrying musicians and attendants. Incense burned on deck, and the sound of flutes and harps carried across the water. People from Tarsus gathered along the banks to watch, standing in linen clothes under the sun and shading their eyes. Antony waited on the quay with his officers, dressed in his usual Roman tunic and cloak. The barge docked, and Cleopatra stepped ashore in a simple but elegant gown of Egyptian linen, her hair arranged in the Greek style she often used for Roman audiences. The meeting began with formal exchanges in the governor's palace. Antony sat in a chair of state while Cleopatra presented her case, explaining the pressures she had faced and the resources Egypt could now offer. Their discussions continued over several days, moving from official business to more relaxed conversations in the evenings. Antony found her intelligent and well-informed about Roman politics and Eastern affairs. She spoke Greek fluently and understood the habits of Roman commanders from her earlier dealings with Caesar. He noticed her ability to manage details of trade and taxation while also discussing larger questions of alliances. The time they spent together in Tarsus shifted from negotiation to personal interest. Antony postponed other administrative tasks and joined Cleopatra for meals on the barge or in the palace gardens. They shared dishes of Nile fish seasoned with herbs, bread baked fresh each morning, and wine from Egyptian vineyards. Servants brought fruit and honeyed sweets in the afternoons. Antony's habits of heavy drinking continued, but Cleopatra matched his pace without losing clarity in conversation. The summer heat in Tarsus kept them indoors during the middle hours, where slaves waved fans and kept rooms cool with damp cloths. By the end of the stay, Antony decided to travel with Cleopatra to Alexandria for the winter. He left deputies in Cilicia to handle routine matters and sailed south with her. The voyage took them along the coast, passing Phoenician ports where merchants traded cedar and purple dye. Antony stood on deck watching the shoreline, thinking about the legions that still waited for their land grants, and the reports coming from Italy about Octavian's growing influence. Cleopatra managed the ship's routine, ordering meals and entertainment for the small party on board. Alexandria welcomed them in late 41 BC. The city's harbours bustled with grain ships and merchant vessels from across the Mediterranean. The lighthouse on Pharos sent its signal far out to sea, guiding their arrival. Cleopatra's palace complex overlooked the water, with marble halls, gardens filled with exotic plants, and rooms decorated with Egyptian and Greek motifs. Antony took quarters there, and the winter months unfolded in a pattern of court life different from anything he had known in Rome or the military camps. Daily routines in the palace began early, with meetings where officials presented accounts of the Nile harvest and grain shipments to Rome. Cleopatra handled these sessions with practiced ease, consulting advisors who wore linen kilts or Greek cloaks according to their roles. Antony joined some discussions, learning about the management of temple lands and the system of royal monopolies on oil and salt. Servants brought breakfast of bread, cheese and fruit picked from palace gardens. The food reflected Egypt's abundant dates stuffed with nuts, lentils cooked with cumin, and fresh fish from the lake. Afternoons often included outings along the Canopic Way, the broad avenue lined with colonnades and statues. Antony and Cleopatra rode in chariots, or walked with a small escort, passing temples where priests conducted daily rituals and markets, where vendors sold papyrus, glassware, and spices. Local people in Alexandria spoke Greek in the streets, but used Egyptian in the back quarters. Children played near fountains, and women carried water jars balanced on their heads. Antony observed the mixture of cultures: Greek scholars debating in the Mausoleum, Egyptian artisans working in workshops, and Jewish merchants trading in their own district. Evenings brought larger gatherings in the palace banqueting halls. Couches were arranged for guests, and courses arrived in sequence. Soups of lentils and herbs, roasted meats with sauces, pastries filled with honey and nuts. Musicians played lyres and flutes while dancers performed in Egyptian style or Greek. Wine flowed from silver cups, often unmixed for those who preferred strength. Antony drank more than most, yet he stayed engaged in the talk around him. Cleopatra hosted these dinners with care, choosing guests from the court, visiting scholars, and Roman officers who had come east with Antony. The winter also included quieter times. Antony and Cleopatra spent hours in the palace library or private rooms, discussing books on history and philosophy that filled the shelves. Servants kept braziers lit against the cooler evenings, and slaves prepared baths with scented oils. Cleopatra had 3 children from her earlier relationship with Caesar, and Antony met them during family moments in the inner palace. The household ran smoothly under her direction, with freedmen and eunuchs managing daily needs. News from the west reached Alexandria by ship. Letters told Antony about Octavian's settlement of veterans in Italy and the continuing tensions over land. Fulvia, Antony's wife back in Rome, had become involved in political moves against Octavian, raising troops in Italy. Antony read these reports carefully but did not alter his plans immediately. He focused on the east, sending orders to governors in Syria and Asia to maintain order and collect tribute. The soldiers who had followed him from Philippi received winter quarters in nearby cities, where they drilled less often and enjoyed local markets. The months in Alexandria allowed Antony to see a different way of ruling. Cleopatra managed her kingdom through a blend of Greek administration and Egyptian tradition, visiting temples for festivals and overseeing the irrigation canals that brought life to the fields. Antony accompanied her on one journey up the Nile, travelling by barge past villages where farmers waved and offered gifts. The riverbanks showed green fields after the flood, and the air carried the scent of wet soil and lotus blossoms. He watched the daily life of the countryside, women spinning flax, men tending oxen, children herding goats, and compared it to the farms he had seen in Gaul and Italy. By spring 40 BC, the time together had formed a close bond. Antony left Egypt with plans to return, and with Cleopatra expecting their first child, he sailed north again to deal with matters in Syria and Asia Minor, carrying new wealth from Egypt to support his provinces. The winter in Alexandria had changed his habits in small ways. He adopted some Eastern styles of dress for comfort and kept closer track of financial records, but his core routines of command and enjoyment remained. The political forces in Rome continued to pull at him through letters and messengers. Yet, for those months, The palace routines and the river city had given him a different perspective on power. Perusian rebellion and Octavian news from Italy reached Antony in Syria early in 40 BC, while he was still settling accounts. In Antioch, and reviewing troop dispositions, messengers arrived dusty from the road with letters that described how Fulvia, his wife, had taken matters into her own hands. She had gathered supporters among the senators and veterans who resented Octavian's land settlements and had raised 8 legions in central Italy. The move aimed to challenge Octavian's control while Antony remained in the east. Fulvia marched north with her brother-in-law Lucius Antonius and laid siege to the town of Perusia, where Octavian's forces had gathered. The conflict turned into a winter blockade, with both sides digging trenches and cutting supply lines around the hilltop town. In Rome, the streets filled with fresh tension. Citizens watched troops move through the Forum and heard reports of fighting near the Tiber. Grain ships arrived less regularly, and the monthly distributions at the public granaries grew shorter again. Families in the Subura stretched their rations with barley and vegetables from rooftop gardens, while vendors in the markets spoke quietly about which side might win and how it would affect prices. Fulvia directed operations from a camp near Perugia, issuing orders through her agents and using her network of clients to recruit more men. She had always been active in politics, managing household affairs and alliances during Antony's absences, but this uprising marked her boldest step. Antony read the letters in his quarters in Antioch, where the air carried the scent of desert dust and incense from nearby temples. He felt a mix of concern and irritation. The legions he had left in Italy were now caught between his wife's ambitions and Octavian's growing power. His own plans for the East collecting tribute, strengthening borders against Parthia, suddenly seemed distant from the immediate threat of civil war breaking out again in the West. He weighed the risks. If he sailed back too quickly, he might lose momentum in the provinces. If he delayed, Octavian could consolidate control entirely. The reports also mentioned that Octavian's troops had surrounded Perugia and were tightening the noose, burning fields and blocking roads. By spring, the siege ended in defeat for Fulvia's side. Octavian's forces broke through, and Lucius Antonius surrendered. Perusia itself suffered damage, with parts of the town burned during the final assault. Fulvia escaped with a small party and sailed east to join Antony. When she arrived in Athens, she brought detailed accounts of the fighting and the hardships faced by their supporters in Italy. Antony met her there, listening to the stories of cold nights in camp and the desperation of soldiers who had run short of food. He saw the toll the effort had taken on her health, yet he recognized her loyalty and the political pressure she had tried to relieve. The defeat forced a reckoning. Antony gathered his closest officers in Athens and reviewed the situation. Octavian had used the Perusian War to portray Antony's supporters as rebels, while he himself appeared as the defender of order. Letters from Rome described how Octavian had confiscated more land for his veterans and strengthened his hold on the city. Antony knew another round of open fighting would drain the resources he had built in the east. He decided to return west to negotiate directly. In the summer of 40 BC, he sailed from Greece with a small escort, leaving deputies to manage the eastern provinces. The voyage brought him back to Brundisium on the Italian coast. Octavian had moved south with his own forces, and the two armies faced each other across the harbour. Tensions ran high among the troops on both sides. Many soldiers had fought together at Philippi and now stood ready to fight each other again. Antony and Octavian met first through intermediaries, then arranged a personal conference. They spoke in a tent set up near the shore, surrounded by guards from each side. The discussion lasted several days, with each man laying out his grievances Antony over the treatment of his brother and wife, Octavian over the Perusian uprising and earlier slights. The talks produced a new agreement. To seal the peace, they arranged a marriage between Antony and Octavia, Octavian's older sister. She was a widow in her late 20s, known for her calm manner and steady character. The wedding took place in Rome later that year, in a simple ceremony attended by the remaining senators and family members. Octavia wore the traditional bridal veil and carried the symbols of a Roman matron. Antony stood beside her in a fresh toga, aware that this union was more political than personal. but hoping it would bring stability. The marriage gave him a direct family link to Octavian, and a reason to keep the peace while he returned to Eastern duties. After the wedding, Antony and Octavia travelled to Athens, where they set up a household in one of the larger residences near the Agora. The city offered a quieter setting than Rome, with its marble colonnades, philosophical schools, and markets selling olives, wine, and cloth from local workshops. Daily life settled into a routine suited to the Greek climate. Mornings began with meetings where Antony reviewed dispatches from the east and issued instructions for governors in Syria and Asia. Octavia managed the household staff, organising meals and correspondence with her brother in Rome. Breakfast consisted of bread, cheese, and fruit, brought from nearby farms, eaten in the courtyard where sunlight filtered through the columns. Antony kept some of his earlier habits. He drank wine in the evenings, often sharing it with visiting officers or Greek friends who joined for conversation. Octavia did not join these gatherings, but maintained her own circle of women from Athenian families, discussing household matters and the education of children. Their marriage produced 2 daughters in the following years, and the household included Antony's children from earlier unions when they visited. Servants kept the rooms clean and prepared baths with scented oils, while freedmen handled the steady flow of letters crossing the sea. Athens itself bustled with its own rhythms. Students walked to lectures in the Stoa or the Academy, carrying scrolls under their arms. Markets near the Agora offered pottery, leather goods, and fresh fish from the port at Piraeus. People wore lighter garments in the summer heat and gathered at fountains to exchange news. Antony and Octavia attended some public festivals, watching processions in honour of Athena or joining the audience at theatrical performances in the open-air theatre on the slope of the Acropolis. The air during these events carried the scent of incense and roasting meat from sacrificial altars. Antony used the time in Athens to strengthen his position without immediate confrontation. He sent agents to Italy to monitor veteran settlements and to the east to ensure tribute flowed steadily. Reports from Rome described Octavian's continued consolidation of power, including new colonies and adjustments to the grain supply. Antony felt the pull of ambition to secure his share of influence, yet the peace with Octavian through Octavia's marriage gave him breathing room. He worried about the long-term balance, his eastern wealth versus Octavian's control of Italy and the legions, but for the moment, the domestic routines in Athens allowed him to plan without the daily pressure of crisis. Octavia proved a steady presence. She wrote regularly to her brother, smoothing small disagreements and passing information that helped maintain the truce. Her calm approach contrasted with Fulvia's more forceful style, and Antony appreciated the stability she brought to the household. Evenings often ended with quieter talks about the children or future arrangements for the provinces. Slaves lit lamps as darkness fell, and the household settled for the night with the distant sound of city life fading outside the walls. The period in Athens lasted into 39 and 38 BC. Antony travelled occasionally to nearby provinces to inspect troops and meet local leaders, returning each time to the family routines. He kept his military habits alive by drilling small units in the countryside outside the city and reviewing equipment with his officers. The soldiers quartered nearby visited markets in Athens, buying extra supplies and sending wages home through bankers. Daily life for ordinary Athenians continued unchanged. Farmers brought produce to market, artisans worked in small shops, and families gathered for meals around simple hearths. News from farther east occasionally interrupted the calm. Parthian forces had begun probing Roman borders, and Antony started planning a future campaign to secure the frontier. He discussed these ideas with Octavia and his staff, weighing the resources needed and the timing. The marriage had bought time, but the larger forces shaping the Roman world rival ambitions, legion loyalties, and the wealth of the provinces continued to move beneath the surface. In Athens, the household maintained its steady pace, with Octavia overseeing the children's lessons in Greek and Latin, and Antony balancing personal life with the demands of his eastern command. The quiet years there offered a pause before the next phase of conflict would draw him back into open rivalry. Parthian invasions. Setbacks Antony left Athens in the spring of 36 BC with a large army assembled from the eastern. Legions and new recruits gathered over the previous years. The force numbered around 13 legions of Roman infantry, supported by cavalry from Gaul, Spain, and allied kingdoms in Asia Minor. He also secured contributions from client rulers, horsemen from Thrace, archers from Crete, and light troops from local regions. The army marched east from Greece through Thrace and Macedonia, then crossed into Asia Minor. Roads carried the columns past familiar landscapes, olive groves in bloom, villages where farmers brought water and bread to the soldiers, and towns that provided billets for the officers. The immediate goal was to recover the standards lost at Carrhae in 53 BC when Crassus had been defeated by the Parthians. Antony also aimed to secure the eastern frontier and punish the Parthian king Phraates IV, supporting the liberators during the civil war. He moved first into Armenia, where King Artavasdes had remained neutral or even aided the enemy in earlier campaigns. Antony summoned Artavasdes to a meeting near the border. The Armenian king arrived with his cavalry but hesitated to commit fully. After tense negotiations, Antony had him arrested and replaced him with a more compliant ruler. The action secured Armenia as a base and brought additional troops and supplies into the Roman fold. From Armenia, the army advanced into Media Atropatene, a region controlled by a Parthian vassal. Antony planned a two-pronged approach. One force under Publius Ventidius had already won victories against Parthian detachments in Syria, clearing the southern route. Antony himself led the main body through mountainous terrain toward the Parthian heartland. The march proved difficult from the start. Summer heat baked the high plateaus, and water sources dried up in places. Soldiers carried their own rations, wheat biscuits, dried meat and vinegar for posca, but pack animals struggled with the load. Mules died from exhaustion or lack of fodder, forcing men to lighten their gear or abandon some equipment. The Parthians avoided pitched battle at first. Their horsemen harassed the Roman column with arrows fired from a distance, then withdrew when infantry closed. Antony kept his men in tight formation with shields raised in the testudo when needed, but the constant skirmishing wore down morale and slowed progress. Supplies ran low as the army moved deeper into enemy territory. Local villages had been evacuated or burned by Parthian scouts, leaving little to forage. Soldiers slaughtered baggage animals for meat and boiled leather straps when hunger set in. Antony ordered strict rationing and punished looting to prevent alienation of potential allies, but the measures could not fully offset the shortages. By autumn, the army reached Phrata, the capital of Media Atropatene. Antony besieged the fortified town, building siege ramps and towers while his engineers worked under arrow fire. The Parthians, under King Phraates, sent a large relief force that circled the Roman lines, cutting off stragglers and intercepting supply trains from Armenia. Antony's cavalry, though strong, could not match the Parthian horse archers in mobility on open ground. Several attempts to break the encirclement failed, with heavy losses in men and horses. The siege dragged on for weeks, and the Roman troops grew weaker from hunger and disease. Dysentery spread through the camps, and men weakened by lack of food fell ill more easily. Antony decided to withdraw before winter, closed the passes back to Armenia. The retreat began in October. The army moved in a long column, with cavalry screening the flanks and rear. Parthian horsemen pressed closely, attacking the baggage train and isolated units. Antony rode up and down the line, encouraging the men and directing countercharges when gaps appeared. One night the Parthians set fire to the Roman camp, forcing a hasty evacuation under moonlight. The march continued through cold nights and dusty days. Soldiers discarded armour and weapons they could no longer carry, and many fell behind, captured or killed by the pursuing enemy. The return route took them through snow-covered mountains as autumn turned to winter. Passes narrowed, and frost made the paths treacherous. Men wrapped themselves in cloaks and blankets taken from the dead or captured gear. Antony shared the hardships, sleeping on the ground with the troops and eating the same reduced rations. He kept a personal guard of veterans who had served with him since Gaul, and they formed a protective ring around him during the worst moments. The army reached the Armenian border after more than a month of retreat, having lost nearly a third of its strength, perhaps 20,000 men dead or missing. Along with most of the baggage and siege equipment, Antony wintered in Antioch after the campaign. The city provided shelter in stone houses and access to grain from Syria and Egypt. He reviewed the survivors, reorganized the remaining legions, and sent letters to Rome explaining the setback. The defeat hurt his reputation among the troops and in the Senate. Reports reached Italy describing the heavy losses and the failure to recover the standards. Octavian's supporters in Rome used the news to question Antony's leadership, while his own allies urged patience and pointed to the difficult terrain and Parthian tactics. In Antioch, Antony re-established his headquarters. The palace overlooked the Orontes River, with courtyards where officers met to discuss repairs and recruitment. He ordered new armour forged in local workshops and sent agents to allied kings for fresh horses and recruits. Daily life in the city continued around him. Markets sold olives, dates and flatbreads. People gathered at baths heated by underground channels, and merchants traded goods from farther east. Antony walked the streets occasionally, observing prices and speaking with veterans who had settled in the province after Philippi. Cleopatra arrived in Antioch during the winter of 37 to 36 BC to join him. She brought ships loaded with grain, clothing and money to help rebuild the army. Their reunion marked the renewal of their earlier bond. Cleopatra stayed in the palace, and they shared quarters in the eastern wing. She managed supplies for the troops and participated in planning sessions, offering insights into Eastern diplomacy from her experience in Alexandria. Their first child together, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, had been born earlier, and a third, Ptolemy Philadelphus, arrived later. The family lived in the palace with nurses and tutors for the children, who played in the gardens and learned Greek letters. Antony spent the following year rebuilding. He strengthened ties with client rulers, adjusted tribute levels to encourage loyalty, and trained the legions in new tactics suited to Parthian warfare, better use of slingers and heavier cavalry support. He avoided another major campaign in 36 BC, focusing instead on consolidation. The setback in Media had cost him dearly in men and prestige, but he retained control of the eastern provinces and the loyalty of most legions. The experience taught him the limits of Roman infantry against mobile horse archers and the importance of secure supply lines in desert and mountain country. In Rome, Octavian continued to strengthen his position, settling more veterans and managing the grain supply. Antony received reports of these moves through couriers and maintained correspondence with Octavia, who remained in Athens with their daughters. The truce held, though strained by mutual suspicions. Antony turned his attention to administrative reforms in Syria and Cilicia, improving roads, repairing aqueducts, and appointing reliable governors. The daily work of province management, tax collection, court cases, and troop pay kept him occupied while he planned a future return against Parthia on better terms. The winter in Antioch allowed recovery for the army and reflection for Antony. He drank less in public to maintain discipline among the officers, though evenings with Cleopatra and close companions still included wine and conversation late into the night. The palace routine's meals of roasted lamb with spices, bread baked in stone ovens, and fruit from the orchards provided a measure of comfort after the hardships of the campaign. Messengers continued to arrive from the west, carrying news of Octavian's actions and reminders that the balance of power in Rome remained delicate. Antony prepared for the long term, knowing the Parthian frontier would require another effort, and that the rivalry with Octavian had not ended. Alexandrian family. Life. After the difficult retreat from Media Atropatene, Antony arranged for the remaining legions to take winter quarters in Syria and Cilicia. He then sailed south with a small staff to Alexandria in late 36 BC, where Cleopatra had prepared quarters for him in the royal palace. The journey along the coast passed familiar ports, with ships carrying grain and supplies that she had sent north earlier. Upon arrival, the harbour bustled as usual, with longshoremen unloading amphorae and merchants calling out prices in Greek and Egyptian. Antony stepped ashore to find the palace staff waiting with fresh linens and a bath drawn with scented oils from the palace gardens. The renewed stay in Alexandria allowed a more settled routine than the military camps or the hurried administration in Antioch. Cleopatra had given birth to their first children together, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, in 40 BC, and their third son Ptolemy Philadelphus arrived in 36 BC. The children lived in the inner apartments of the palace, with nurses and Greek tutors who taught them letters, simple arithmetic, and stories from Homer and Egyptian myths. Antony saw them daily during quieter hours, watching the boys practice with small wooden swords in the courtyard and the girl arrange flowers from the garden. The family meals took place in a private dining room overlooking the harbour, where servants brought dishes of Nile perch baked with herbs, lentils stewed with cumin, fresh bread, and dates stuffed with almonds. The children ate smaller portions and listened to stories told by their mother about the river floods and the gods who protected Egypt. Cleopatra managed the household with the same care she applied to the kingdom. She wore simple linen dresses most days, pinned with gold brooches, and kept her hair in the Greek style for comfort in the palace. Antony adopted lighter clothing as well, tunics of Egyptian cotton rather than heavy Roman wool to suit the warmer climate. Mornings began early with meetings in the administrative wing, where officials presented reports on the grain harvest, canal repairs, and shipments to Rome. Antony joined some of these sessions, reviewing accounts written on papyrus and suggesting adjustments to tax rates for certain districts. The work felt familiar from his time in Gaul and Syria, but the scale involved managing temple estates and royal monopolies that supplied oil, salt, and papyrus to the entire Mediterranean. Afternoons often included walks along the Canopic Way or short sails on the palace barge across the harbour. Antony and Cleopatra travelled with a modest escort, passing temples where priests performed daily rituals and markets where vendors sold glassware, perfumes, and spices. Local families in Alexandria went about their business, women carrying water jars on their heads, artisans hammering metal in open workshops, children playing near public fountains. The mixture of Greek, Egyptian, and other peoples created a constant hum of different languages and customs. Antony observed these scenes quietly, noting how the city's wealth supported both the royal court and the ordinary households that lined the side streets. Evenings in the palace followed a pattern suited to the Hellenistic court. Larger dinners in the banqueting hall included officials, visiting scholars from the Mausian, and Roman officers who had come east with Antony. Couches were arranged around low tables, and courses arrived in sequence. Soups of vegetables and lentils, roasted meats with sauces made from fish or herbs, pastries filled with honey and nuts. Musicians played soft lyre music in the background, and servants kept cups filled with wine from local vineyards or imports from Greece. Antony drank steadily but maintained enough clarity to discuss provincial matters with the guests. Cleopatra chose the topics carefully, guiding conversations toward philosophy or history, rather than open politics. The court customs differed noticeably from Roman practices. In Alexandria, officials and nobles wore finer linens and sometimes adopted Egyptian styles for ceremonies, while Roman officers kept their short hair and simple tunics. Festivals blended traditions. Cleopatra led processions to the Temple of Serapis on appointed days, and Antony participated in Roman-style sacrifices when legions required them. The children learned both sets of customs, speaking Greek at home and hearing Egyptian stories from their nurses. Antony's inner thoughts during these months turned often to the balance he sought, securing the East's resources to support his legions, while keeping Octavian at arm's length through the marriage to Octavia. He wrote regular letters to Athens, where Octavia remained with their daughters, updating her on the children's health and the administrative progress. Diplomatic visitors arrived steadily in Alexandria. Envoys from client kingdoms in Judea, Nabatea, and Cappadocia came with gifts of incense, horses, and precious stones. Antony met them in the audience hall, listening to reports on border conditions and trade routes. Cleopatra sat beside him on a matching throne, offering insights into local politics that helped shape decisions. These meetings produced agreements on tribute levels and military support, strengthening the eastern network without immediate fighting. Messengers from Rome also came regularly, carrying news of Octavian's veteran settlements and grain distributions. Antony read these dispatches in the evening, weighing the reports against his own plans for another Parthian effort once the legions recovered. Daily palace life included quieter family moments. The children played in the shaded gardens where fountains kept the air cool, and exotic plants from India and Arabia grew in orderly beds. Antony sometimes joined them, showing the boys how to hold a practice shield or telling simple stories of his marches in Gaul. Cleopatra oversaw their education personally, selecting tutors who taught both Roman and Hellenistic subjects. Servants prepared baths each evening with warm water and oils scented with myrrh, and the household retired early when no official dinners were scheduled. The routines brought a sense of order after the hardships of the Parthian campaign, though Antony still carried the memory of lost men and failed sieges in his quieter reflections. The year 35 BC saw continued focus on recovery. Antony sent orders north to Syria for new recruits and equipment, while Cleopatra arranged shipments of grain and clothing for the troops. The palace workshops produced armour and weapons, and local merchants supplied leather and bronze. Antony inspected these preparations during morning walks through the barracks area near the harbour, speaking with centurions about training schedules and morale. The soldiers quartered in Alexandria enjoyed lighter duties, visiting city markets for extra food and sending wages home through bankers who operated near the docks. Inner ambitions stirred during this period. Antony envisioned a stable Eastern Empire that could rival Rome in wealth and culture, with Alexandria as a second centre of power. He discussed these ideas with Cleopatra in private rooms where maps of the provinces lay spread on tables. Fears of Octavian's growing strength in the west remained present, but stayed in the background while the family routines continued. He maintained correspondence with Octavia, who managed their household in Athens and kept lines open to Rome. The children from different unions visited when travel allowed, bringing a fuller sense of household life to the palace. Cultural contrasts appeared in small ways each day. Roman officers preferred simple meals and short hair, while Egyptian courtiers favoured elaborate banquets and styled wigs for ceremonies. Antony moved between both worlds, wearing Roman military dress for troop reviews and lighter Eastern garments for palace evenings. Cleopatra adapted her own appearance according to the occasion, choosing Greek styles for Roman guests and traditional Egyptian regalia for local festivals. The palace staff, freedmen, eunuchs, and slaves kept everything running smoothly, preparing food from palace kitchens, cleaning marble floors, and managing the constant flow of visitors. By 34 BC, the family had settled into a comfortable pattern. The children grew stronger, learning to swim in palace pools and ride small ponies in the gardens. Antony's habits included regular exercise with the troops and evenings of wine with close companions, though he drank more moderately in the presence of the children. Political forces from the west continued to shape decisions through letters and envoys, yet the daily life in Alexandria offered a measure of stability. The routines of court, family, and administration filled the months, allowing Antony to rebuild his strength and resources, while the larger rivalry with Octavian waited in the distance. Donations of Alexandria. Antony spent the early months of 34 BC completing preparations in Alexandria for a formal triumph that would mark his recent successes in Armenia. The campaign there had been shorter and more successful than the Parthian effort 2 years earlier. He had returned with King Artavasdes in chains, secured new alliances along the border, and brought back substantial tribute in gold and silver. The legions that marched with him rested in quarters near the city, their equipment repaired in local forges, and their ranks filled with fresh recruits from Syria. Antony reviewed the troops regularly on the parade ground by the harbour, watching them practice formation marches and weapon drills under the morning sun, while the sea breeze carried the scent of salt and drying fish nets. The triumph took place in the autumn. Unlike the traditional Roman procession through the Forum, this one followed Alexandrian customs blended with Roman elements. Antony entered the city on a chariot drawn by white horses, wearing a purple cloak and a crown of laurel. Cleopatra rode beside him in a golden carriage, dressed in the regalia of Isis with a crown of horns and a solar disk. The children followed in smaller chariots. Alexander Helios in the costume of an Armenian king, Cleopatra Selene in the robes of a Greek princess, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus carried on a litter. Behind them came wagons loaded with captured Armenian treasures, gold vessels, fine carpets, and chains from the defeated king. Crowds lined the canopic way, waving palm branches and calling out in Greek and Egyptian. Vendors closed their stalls for the day, and families brought children to watch from rooftops or balconies overlooking the broad avenue. After the procession, Antony and Cleopatra ascended a platform erected in the gymnasium, a large open space near the palace used for public assemblies. There, in front of thousands of Alexandrians and visiting dignitaries, he announced a series of territorial grants that became known as the Donations of Alexandria. He declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and ruler over Egypt, Cyprus, and Coeli Syria. Alexander Helios received Armenia, Media, and Parthia lands, still partly unconquered but claimed in advance. Cleopatra Selene was given Cyrene and Libya. The youngest son, Ptolemy Philadelphus, obtained Phoenicia, Syria, and Cilicia. Antony presented the children with crowns and sceptres suited to their new titles, and the crowd cheered each announcement while priests burned incense on nearby altars. The ceremony lasted several hours under the clear autumn sky. Antony spoke from notes prepared in Greek and Latin, explaining the grants as rewards for loyalty and a way to stabilize the East under joint rule. Cleopatra sat on a throne of gold and ivory, nodding approval at each division. Local nobles in fine linen stood in rows, and Roman officers in their military cloaks watched from a separate section. After the speeches came a public feast in the palace grounds, with tables set for officials and open distributions of bread and wine to the people outside the gates. Servants carried trays of roasted meats, stuffed figs, and honeyed pastries while musicians played flutes and drums. Antony moved among the guests, sharing cups of wine and accepting congratulations, though he kept his own thoughts focused on the practical effects of the new arrangements. The donations reshaped the map of the Eastern Mediterranean on paper. Egypt gained direct control over Cyprus and parts of Syria, regions long tied to Roman provinces. The children's kingdoms covered vast areas rich in grain, timber, and trade routes. Antony retained overall Roman command and the loyalty of the legions, but the public ceremony presented Cleopatra and her family as co-rulers rather than subordinates. In Alexandria, the event strengthened support among the Greek and Egyptian populations, who saw it as a return to the glory days of the Ptolemies. People talked about the new titles in taverns and marketplaces, and merchants began adjusting their trade plans to the expanded royal domains. News of the ceremony travelled west by fast ships, leaving the harbour within days. Messengers carried detailed accounts to Rome, where the Senate and streets reacted with growing unease. Citizens gathered in the forum to hear heralds read summaries of the grants, and the reports spread quickly through neighbourhoods. In the Subura and Aventine, families discussed the news over evening meals of porridge and vegetables, wondering how the division of provinces would affect grain shipments or veteran land grants back in Italy. Senators in their houses on the Palatine and Esquiline met privately to share copies of the dispatches, many viewing the donations as an open challenge to Roman authority. Octavian, now firmly in control of the West, used the reports in meetings with his allies, pointing to the Eastern titles as evidence that Antony had abandoned Roman traditions. Antony knew the reaction would come. He had received letters from Octavia in Athens warning of the Senate's discontent, and from his own supporters in Rome urging restraint. Yet he proceeded with the ceremony because the grants served immediate needs. They secured Egyptian resources for the legions, rewarded Cleopatra's financial help after the Parthian losses, and created a network of client kingdoms loyal to his side. In the weeks after the event, he remained in Alexandria, handling the administrative details, appointing governors for the new territories, adjusting tax collection, and sending orders to troops stationed in Syria. Mornings in the palace involved meetings with scribes who updated maps and prepared decrees on fresh papyrus rolls. Cleopatra reviewed each document, suggesting changes based on local knowledge of irrigation rights or temple revenues. Daily life in Alexandria continued its steady pace despite the political stir. The children began learning the customs of their assigned kingdoms through tutors who taught them regional histories and languages. Alexander Helios practiced riding in the palace grounds, imagining himself as ruler of Armenia, while Cleopatra Selene studied maps of Cyrene and practiced courtly Greek phrases. Antony joined family outings along the Nile Canal, where barges carried grain from the fields and farmers waved from the banks. The air smelled of wet earth after the recent flood, and the family shared simple meals of bread and fish under linen awnings. Evenings brought quieter moments in the private apartments, where servants lit lamps and the children listened to stories before bedtime. Rumours from Rome grew stronger through the winter. Letters described how Octavian's circle had begun circulating copies of the donations decree, calling it a betrayal of the Roman people. Some senators spoke openly in the Curia against Antony, demanding that he return to Italy and explain his actions. Antony read these reports in his study overlooking the harbour, weighing the growing pressure against the strength he had built in the east. He continued to drill the legions outside the city, watching them march in formation and practice javelin throws, while the Mediterranean sun warmed the exercise field. The soldiers, many of whom had served since Philippi, received extra pay from the new tribute and spoke among themselves about the possibility of another campaign or a return west. Cleopatra remained closely involved in the planning. She hosted smaller dinners for key officials where the conversation turned to trade routes and border security rather than open politics. Antony drank wine during these gatherings but kept his focus sharp, discussing supply lines for future operations. The palace routines baths scented with myrrh, fresh linens changed daily, and meals prepared in the royal kitchens provided stability amid the rising tension. Messengers arrived weekly with updates from Syria and Athens, and Antony dictated replies late into the night, using scribes who worked by lamplight. By early 33 BC, the donations had become a central point of division. In Roman streets, people repeated exaggerated versions of the ceremony, some claiming Antony planned to move the capital to Alexandria or crown Cleopatra Queen of Rome itself. The Senate passed resolutions questioning the legality of the grants, though enforcement remained impossible while Antony controlled the eastern legions. Antony responded by sending envoys to Rome, with explanations framed as administrative reforms rather than personal ambition. He also wrote to Octavia, asking her to calm matters with her brother and assuring her of his continued respect for their marriage. The event marked a clear shift in how power was presented. Antony had moved from Roman consul and triumvir to a figure ruling jointly with an Eastern queen, using Hellenistic ceremony to bind the provinces together. The children's titles created future claims that could stabilize the region for decades. In Alexandria, the people celebrated with festivals and extra grain distributions, while ordinary families in Rome tightened their belts and listened for news of what the next sailing season would bring. Antony remained in the palace through the winter, balancing family life with a growing political storm, aware that the donations had drawn a sharper line between East and West. Propaganda clash. With Octavian, the donations of Alexandria in 34 BC had set off a steady stream of reports reaching Italy by the following spring. Ships arriving at Ostia carried letters, copies of decrees, and eyewitness accounts that spread through Rome within days. In the Forum, heralds read public announcements while small groups gathered around to discuss the new titles given to Cleopatra and her children. Senators met in private houses on the Palatine, passing around wax tablets with summaries of the ceremony. Many viewed the grants as a direct insult to Roman sovereignty, especially since Antony had presented them as a Roman commander dividing provinces that belonged to the Republic. Octavian seized on the moment to shape the narrative in his favour. Octavian controlled the western provinces and the city itself. He had spent the years since Philippi building a network of loyal veterans, senators and urban clients. His house on the Palatine became a centre for meetings where advisors drafted speeches and letters. He began circulating versions of the donations that emphasized the foreign elements. Cleopatra on a golden throne, the children in Eastern costumes, Antony wearing a diadem in public. These accounts reached taverns near the Circus Maximus, where off-duty soldiers and shopkeepers repeated them over cups of posca. The story grew in telling some claimed Antony planned to make Alexandria the new capital, or to crown Cleopatra queen over Rome. Grain distributors at the dole points added their own comments, noting that Eastern wealth seemed to flow to Egypt rather than to Roman families. Antony received copies of these reports in Alexandria during the winter of 34 to 33 BC. Messengers arrived weekly with sealed letters from his supporters in Rome and from Octavia in Athens. He read them in the palace study, where lamps burned late and scribes waited to take dictation. The accusations stung more than he expected. He had always presented himself as a Roman commander, loyal to Caesar's legacy. Yet the propaganda painted him as a man seduced by Eastern luxury and foreign influence. Cleopatra reviewed some of the letters with him, offering calm analysis of how the stories were being shaped to divide opinion. Antony dictated replies that denied any intent to undermine Rome and framed the donations as administrative measures to secure the frontier. In Rome, Octavian escalated the campaign through the Senate and public orations. He spoke in the Curia about the need to protect Roman traditions against foreign corruption. Friends of his circulated pamphlets, short scrolls copied by scribes, and passed hand to hand that listed Antony's supposed excesses: drunken feasts in Alexandria, adoption of Eastern dress, neglect of his Roman wife Octavia. The pamphlets reached the Subura and Aventine, where people read them aloud in courtyards or near fountains. Urban plebs who had once benefited from Caesar's distributions now heard that Antony favoured Egypt over Italy. Veterans settled in colonies grumbled about delayed land grants, while Eastern kingdoms received new titles. Octavia remained in Athens, managing the household and writing to her brother. She urged moderation in private letters, reminding Octavian of the marriage that still linked their families. Octavian treated her with respect in public, but continued the attacks on Antony. In 33 BC, he began refusing to hand over provinces that should have passed to Antony under the Triumvirate agreement. When the Triumvirate's 5-year term expired in 33 BC, Octavian let it lapse without renewal, positioning himself as the defender of the Republic, while Antony held no formal office in the West. Antony responded from Alexandria by sending envoys to Rome with his own version of events. They carried letters addressed to the Senate and people, explaining the donations as rewards for loyalty and necessary for Eastern stability. The envoys spoke in the Curia, but Octavian's allies interrupted or questioned their accounts. Antony also wrote to Octavia, asking her to return to Rome and act as intermediary. She agreed and sailed to Italy in late 33 BC, bringing their 2 daughters. In Rome, she lived quietly in the family house, receiving visitors and passing messages between the 2 sides. Her presence reminded senators of the personal ties that still existed, though it did little to slow the propaganda. The Senate grew more polarized. Some members, veterans of the civil wars or those who had benefited from Antony's earlier clemency, defended him in private conversations. Others, aligned with Octavian, spoke openly against him. Octavian avoided declaring open war but began preparing the ground. He strengthened his fleet in Italy, recruited more troops, and secured grain supplies from Africa and Sicily to prevent shortages in the city. In the streets, people noticed increased military traffic legions moving through the gates, ships fitting out at Ostia, and the air carried rumours of coming conflict. Antony countered by consolidating his eastern base. He summoned Cleopatra to Ephesus in the spring of 32 BC, where he had moved his headquarters. She arrived with a fleet of ships and additional funds. Together they reviewed the legions quartered in Asia Minor, inspecting equipment and morale. Antony addressed the troops in open fields, promising pay and land when the current tensions resolved. The soldiers, many of whom had served under him since Philippi, cheered his words and accepted the presence of Cleopatra's Egyptian contingents alongside Roman standards. In Rome, the propaganda reached a peak. Octavian obtained Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins. Antony had deposited it there earlier and read selected parts to a Senate meeting. The document confirmed the donations to Cleopatra's children and requested burial in Alexandria if he died in the east. Octavian presented this as proof that Antony intended to transfer Roman power to Egypt. The Senate reacted with outrage. Senators voted to declare war not on Antony but on Cleopatra, framing the conflict as defense against a foreign queen rather than civil war. Antony was stripped of his titles, though he still commanded the Eastern legions. Antony learned of the declaration in Ephesus. He called a council with his officers and Cleopatra to discuss the next steps. The decision was made to move west. The combined fleet Roman ships from Syria and Egypt's navy sailed for Greece in the summer of 32 BC. Antony and Cleopatra established headquarters in Athens briefly, then moved to a camp near Actium on the western coast. Troops landed and began building fortifications along the shore. Octavian's forces under Agrippa had already crossed to Greece and seized key ports. The two sides faced each other across the Ambracian Gulf, with fleets gathering and scouts reporting daily movements. In Rome, the war declaration brought mixed reactions. Many senators supported Octavian, seeing him as the protector of tradition. Urban plebes worried about grain supplies, but trusted Octavian's control of the West. Veterans remembered Antony's earlier victories but had received land from Octavian. Octavia left Rome quietly, returning to Athens with the children. She lived there through the coming months, receiving news from both sides and keeping the household running. Antony's camp at Actium grew into a large fortified position. Tents stretched across hillsides, supply ships unloaded grain and timber, and soldiers built ramps for artillery. Cleopatra's ships anchored nearby, their crews maintaining discipline under Egyptian officers. Antony met with commanders each morning, reviewing maps and intelligence from scouts. Evenings brought strategy discussions in his tent, with wine passed but decisions kept sharp. The propaganda from Rome had reached the troops through letters and returning messengers. Some grumbled about fighting for an Egyptian queen, but most remained loyal to Antony after years of shared campaigns. The clash of propaganda had hardened positions on both sides. Octavian portrayed Antony as a traitor, influenced by foreign luxury. Antony presented himself as the rightful heir to Caesar's legacy, defending the East against Western ambition. The armies and fleets now faced each other, with the outcome depending on strategy, morale, and the coming naval battle. In Rome, people waited for news from Greece, buying their daily bread and watching the skies for returning ships that might bring word of victory or defeat. Defeat at Actium. The opposing forces gathered along the western coast of Greece through the summer of 31 BC. Antony and Cleopatra had established their main camp at Actium, on the southern side of the Ambracian Gulf. The position offered a sheltered harbour for the fleet and open ground for the legions to drill. Tents covered the hillsides in orderly rows, supply depots stood near the shore, and earthworks protected the perimeter. Soldiers from the eastern legions, many of whom had marched with Antony since Philippi, carried out daily routines. Morning roll calls, weapon maintenance, and short marches to keep fitness. The fleet anchored in the Gulf, Roman quinquiremes alongside Egyptian vessels with their higher prows and painted hulls. Crews swabbed decks, repaired rigging, and practiced manoeuvres in open water when the wind allowed. Octavian's army and navy, commanded largely by Agrippa, occupied the opposite shore near the town of Actium itself. They had arrived earlier, seizing the narrow entrance to the Gulf and building fortified positions on the headlands. Agrippa's ships patrolled the straits, preventing easy resupply by sea and forcing Antony's fleet to remain inside the Gulf. The Roman legions under Octavian camped on higher ground, with clear lines of sight across the water. Scouts moved constantly between the lines, reporting on troop movements, supply levels, and morale. The two sides watched each other across the narrow channel, exchanging occasional arrow fire when small boats ventured too close. Daily life in Antony's camp followed a familiar military pattern. Reveille came before dawn with trumpet calls echoing across the tents. Men ate quick breakfasts of barley porridge and watered wine from their mess kits. Centurions inspected equipment, shields polished, swords sharpened, sandals repaired, and led small unit drills on the open fields. The air smelled of wood smoke from cooking fires, horse sweat from the cavalry lines, and the salt tang of the sea. Officers met in Antony's headquarters tent each morning to review intelligence and discuss strategy. Antony walked the camp regularly, speaking with centurions and legionaries, checking on the sick in the hospital tents, and encouraging the men with promises of victory and rewards. Cleopatra's presence in the camp drew mixed reactions. Some soldiers accepted her as a valuable ally who had brought ships and funds, while others muttered about fighting under Eastern banners. The fleet grew restless inside the Gulf. Weeks passed with no decisive action. Supplies arrived by land from Epirus and Macedonia, but the blockade tightened. Grain rations shrank, and fresh water had to be carried from inland springs. Sickness spread through the crowded tents, dysentery from poor sanitation, fevers from the summer heat. Antony ordered stricter camp hygiene and sent foraging parties into the countryside, but the local villages had already been stripped by both armies. Morale dipped among the troops. Letters from Italy reached some men, describing Octavian's victories in Sicily and the steady grain supply in Rome. Desertions increased, though Antony's officers executed those caught to maintain discipline. Cleopatra kept her quarters in a large tent near the headquarters, surrounded by her own guards and advisors. She met with Antony daily to discuss fleet movements and diplomatic overtures. Envoys crossed the lines under truce flags, carrying proposals for negotiation. Octavian refused any settlement that left Antony in command of Eastern legions or Cleopatra in control of Egypt. The talks went nowhere, and each side prepared for battle. Antony's plan centered on breaking the blockade with a combined naval and land assault. He positioned part of the army on land to threaten Octavian's rear, while the fleet attempted to force the strait. Cleopatra's ships would support the main effort, carrying extra marines and archers. The battle came on September 2, 31 BC. The morning started calm, with light winds and clear skies. Antony's fleet rode out of the Gulf in 3 lines, the centre under his direct command, the left and right under trusted officers. Cleopatra's squadron waited in reserve near the rear. Octavian's ships formed a crescent across the entrance, Agrippa directing from a flagship. The 2 fleets closed slowly at first, then with increasing speed as oars dipped in unison. The clash began near the strait, where the confined water made manoeuvring difficult. Fighting lasted through the day. Roman ships rammed and grappled. Marines boarded enemy vessels with swords and javelins. The noise carried across the water, crashing timbers, shouts in Latin and Greek, the twang of bowstrings. Antony's centre pushed forward but met stiff resistance. Agrippa's ships used firepots and boarding hooks to disable several large quinquiremes. Smoke rose from burning hulls, and the wind shifted, carrying it across Antony's lines. Cleopatra's squadron, seeing the battle turn against the main force, broke formation and sailed south with full sails. Antony, on his flagship, followed after her with a small detachment of ships. The remaining fleet fought on but gradually withdrew as the day ended. The land forces watched the naval battle from the shore. Antony's legions held their positions but did not engage in a major assault. When the fleet retreated, the army began an orderly withdrawal from the camp. Soldiers packed tents, loaded wagons, and marched south under cover of night. The retreat was disciplined at first, with centurions keeping order and rear guards watching for pursuit. Octavian's troops advanced cautiously, taking the abandoned camp and capturing supplies left behind. Antony's men reached the southern coast and embarked on the remaining ships that had not fled earlier. The evacuation took several days, with wounded loaded first and equipment abandoned when space ran short. Antony and Cleopatra reached the Peloponnese, then sailed east to Egypt. The journey took weeks, with stops at friendly ports for water and repairs. Antony spent much of the time on deck, watching the coastline and speaking little with his officers. The defeat at Actium had cost the fleet heavily, perhaps half the ships lost or captured, and the army dispersed, some units surrendering to Octavian, others scattering to join Brutus's old garrisons in the east. The soldiers who followed Antony to Egypt felt the weight of the loss. Many had fought for him since Gaul or Philippi. Now they faced an uncertain future in a foreign land. In Alexandria, Antony and Cleopatra re-established themselves in the palace. The city received them quietly, no processions, no public celebrations. The children waited in the inner apartments, unaware of the full scale of the defeat. Antony resumed administrative work, sending orders to remaining garrisons in Syria and Asia Minor to hold their posts. Cleopatra managed grain stores and finances, preparing for a possible siege. The palace routines returned meals served in the private dining room, children's lessons in the gardens, baths prepared in the evenings, but the mood had changed. Officers met in smaller groups discussing what forces remained and whether Octavian would follow. Octavian did not pursue immediately. He secured Greece and the Aegean, then returned to Italy to settle his veterans and consolidate control. In Rome, the news of Actium arrived by fast courier. The Senate voted honours for Octavian, and the city held thanksgiving sacrifices in the temples. People gathered in the forum to hear the dispatches read aloud, some relieved that the long tension had ended, others worried about the future of the Republic. Grain supplies remained steady, and Octavian promised no new taxes to pay for the war. Antony stayed in Alexandria through the winter. He trained the remaining legions and Egyptian troops, though numbers had dwindled. The palace staff kept daily life functioning, fresh bread baked each morning, lamps lit at dusk, gardens tended for herbs and flowers. Antony spent time with the children, teaching the boys basic weapon handling and listening to their lessons. Cleopatra managed the household and court with steady calm, meeting with advisors to plan defences. The defeat at Actium had broken the Eastern coalition, but Egypt itself remained intact, its wealth and grain reserves offering a last line of resistance. The months after Actium passed in preparation and reflection. Antony knew Octavian would come eventually. Messengers brought reports of Roman forces gathering in Asia Minor and Syria. Antony and Cleopatra discussed options: fortify Alexandria, negotiate terms, or fight one final campaign. The palace, once a place of expansion and family life, now felt like the centre of a shrinking domain. Outside the walls, the city continued its rhythms: markets open, ships in the harbour, people buying their daily needs, but everyone sensed the end of the old order approaching. In the spring of 30 BC, Octavian's forces crossed from Syria into Egypt. The legions moved along the coastal road from Pelusium, where the gates opened without resistance after the local commander surrendered. Antony had positioned what remained of his army east of Alexandria, near the old Canopic branch of the Nile. The troops numbered perhaps 20,000 infantry and a few thousand cavalry, many of them veterans who had followed him for more than 15 years. They built a camp of earth and timber, dug ditches, and waited. Antony rode out each morning to inspect the lines, speaking with centurions about water supplies and the condition of the horses. The soldiers ate their reduced rations of barley and dried fish, repaired sandals worn thin by the long retreat from Actium, and watched the eastern horizon for dust clouds. Octavian approached cautiously. He had no wish for a long siege that might drain his resources before he could return to Rome. His army advanced in good order, Agrippa commanding the fleet that now controlled the sea approaches. Alexandria itself remained calm on the surface. Markets along the Canopic Way still opened at dawn, vendors selling bread, olives, and fresh Nile perch. Families drew water from public fountains and carried it home in jars balanced on their heads. Children played in the side streets, unaware of the scale of the approaching danger. Inside the palace, Cleopatra kept the daily routines intact. Scribes updated grain inventories, servants prepared meals in the royal kitchens, and the children continued their lessons in the shaded gardens. Antony joined them when he could, sitting on a low bench while the boys practiced with wooden swords and the girl recited Greek verses. The two armies met outside the city walls on the 1st of August. The fighting lasted only a few hours. Antony's cavalry charged first and drove back Octavian's right wing, but the Roman legions held firm in the centre and counterattacked. dust rose thick from the dry ground, and the shouts of officers cut through the clash of metal. Antony's infantry began to waver after the initial success. Many men threw down their shields and ran toward the city gates. Antony rode among them, trying to rally the ranks, but the line had broken. He returned to the palace with a small group of officers, his cloak stained with sweat and dust. That afternoon, a rumour reached the palace that Cleopatra had taken her own life to avoid capture. The story spread quickly among the remaining troops and inside the royal quarters. Antony had long declared that he would not survive her. He walked to his private chamber, removed his armour with help from a freedman, and asked for a sword. He drove the blade into his abdomen with a single, steady motion. Blood flowed across the marble floor as he collapsed onto a couch. Servants carried him, still breathing, through the corridors to the upper room where Cleopatra waited behind locked doors. She had not died. The rumour had been false. When the doors opened and Antony was brought inside, she took him in her arms on the bed she had prepared for her own end. He spoke a few words, asking her to make peace with Octavian if she could, and died there in her embrace. Cleopatra remained with his body for hours. She had already arranged her own preparations. Servants brought a basket of figs containing a small asp hidden among the fruit. She held the snake to her breast and allowed it to bite. The poison worked quickly. She lay down beside Antony, arranged her robes with care, and passed quietly. Her attendants closed the doors and waited. When Octavian's officers entered the palace the next day, they found the queen and the Roman commander side by side, their faces calm in death. Octavian entered Alexandria on the 3rd of August. The city gates stood open, and the people watched in silence as his troops marched along the broad avenues. No resistance remained. He visited the palace, viewed the bodies, and ordered them buried together with royal honours in the tomb Cleopatra had prepared. The children Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken into Roman custody and later sent to Italy to be raised by Octavia. Antony's older children from earlier marriages received protection through family connections. Octavian showed restraint. He executed only a few of Antony's closest officers and spared most of the Alexandrian population. Within weeks, Egypt became a Roman province. Octavian appointed a prefect to govern it directly, answerable only to himself. The royal treasury, the granaries, and the temple lands passed into Roman control. Grain ships continued to sail for Ostia as before, but now, under imperial oversight, the palace staff remained in place at first, continuing their routines while Roman clerks inventoried every storeroom and every scroll in the library. Ordinary Alexandrians returned to their daily tasks. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn, fishermen cast nets in the harbour, and women carried water from the fountains. The city looked much the same, yet the centre of power had shifted permanently to Rome. In Rome itself, the news arrived by fast courier in September. The Senate declared a public holiday and voted Octavian the title Augustus the following year. Citizens gathered in the forum to hear the announcements read aloud, then returned home to tell their families. Many felt relief that the long civil wars had ended. Shopkeepers reopened their stalls, veterans collected their final land grants, and the monthly grain dole flowed without interruption. The ordinary rhythms of life, morning bread, evening talk at the fountain, children playing in shared courtyards continued as they had for centuries. Only now, under a single guiding hand, Antony's story closed with the quiet absorption of Egypt into the Roman world. The man who had risen from the Subura taverns, fought beside Caesar, governed Italy in wartime, and ruled the east from Alexandria lay buried beside the queen he had loved. The legions that once marched under his standards now served Augustus. The family he left behind, children scattered between Rome and the provinces, carried his name into the new age. The republic he had known transformed into an empire, its boundaries stretching from Britain to the Euphrates. In the streets of Rome and Alexandria alike, people spoke less of the dead commander and more of the peace that had finally arrived. The long journey we have shared tonight now draws gently to its close. Antony's life, with all its ambitions, loyalties, victories, and final choices, settles into the quiet record of history. The same streets he once walked as a young man in Rome still echo with footsteps today, and the Nile continues its steady flow past the palaces where he spent his last days. Nothing remains unchanged, yet everything connects. The ordinary rhythms of bread baking, children laughing, and lamps being lit at dusk have carried humanity forward through every age. Just as they will carry you safely through the night, let the soft hum of the fan, the familiar weight of your blanket, and the slow rhythm of your breathing remind you that the world keeps its balance even after the greatest storms have passed. Rest now, knowing that tomorrow will bring its own simple moments.